Long before the name Genghis Khan was whispered with reverence or fear, the vast and rolling plains of Central Asia were already home to a landscape of ancient nomadic cultures, warrior tribes, and proud clans. Mongolia, blanketed by endless grasslands, shaped not only the climate and the animals that roamed there, but also the spirit of the peoples who called it home. Living under cutting winds, beneath skies that seemed to stretch forever, and with their feet grounded on a land that was both arid and fertile, the early Mongols had no palaces or permanent cities. They lived in circular tents, called göz, or yurts, made of lightweight wood, felt and leather, portable enough to follow the rhythm of their seasonal migrations. They moved with their herds seeking water, pasture, and shelter, guided by oral traditions passed down through generations that told stories of mythical ancestors, deeds of honor, betrayal, and blood. Their way of life revolved around a deep bond with horses, camels, sheep, goats, and yaks. Survival depended on resilience and mobility. From an early age, children learned to ride, shoot arrows, and hunt, for the steppes did not forgive weakness. Clans were familial entities bound by blood and temporary alliances. There was no centralized state or king. Power was dispersed, negotiated through courage, leadership, and the ability to provide security and resources. Leadership arose organically from the most charismatic or ruthless individuals, and the rise of one chief often meant the bloody downfall of another. Instability was the rule, not the exception. To live in the steppes was to accept chaos as a natural order. Justice was swift, tribal, and often violent. Cattle raids, kidnappings, family feuds, and political betrayals were common. Loyalty was deeply personal, not to a nation but to a lineage, a war brother, or a vow sealed under the gods of the eternal blue sky. The spirituality of pre-imperial Mongol peoples was rooted in shamanism and tengrism, a belief system that revered the sky, the earth, the spirits of ancestors, and invisible forces inhabiting animals, mountains, and rivers. Shamans dressed in ceremonial garments of bone, hides, and metal acted as intermediaries between the physical world and the spirit realm, conducting rituals, healings, and divinations. Culturally, these tribes preserved a rich oral tradition of epic poetry, music, and throat singing. Communication between distant clans relied on horseback messengers, and marital alliances were a key part of nomadic politics. In times of peace, tribes traded goods such as furs, dried meat, fermented milk, weapons, and horses with sedentary neighbors like the Chinese or other Western peoples. In times of war, those same neighbors became targets of raids and lightning expeditions. The balance between war and trade was fragile, often shattered by disputes of honor or necessity. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, the Mongolian steppes were divided among various groups: the Merkits, the Tatars, the Naimans, the Khanates, and of course the Mongols themselves. None held complete control over the land. Though they shared language and similar customs, they were in constant conflict. Each aspired to dominate the others and assert its lineage as supreme, but none could do so for long. These bloody tribal wars would become fertile ground for the emergence of a figure who would break the cycle, unite the clans, and unleash the peoples of the steppe upon the world. It was a world where the fragility of life was matched by the brutality of honor, where the blue sky of Tengri watched over every battle and every oath sealed in blood, an ancestral world, almost invisible to the great empires of the south and west, but on the verge of becoming the epicenter of a geopolitical earthquake. For in the midst of this ancient chaos, a boy named Temujin was being born, the future Genghis Khan, who would change the fate of the steppes and rewrite the history of humanity with iron, fire, and unshakable vision. Pre-imperial Mongol society was deeply tribal, shaped by blood ties, alliances, and unwritten codes that sustained an order as ancient as the steppe itself. These peoples lived in a constant tension between cooperation and rivalry. The foundation of their social structure was the clan, known as the Omoboko, a unit composed of several families linked by shared ancestry or oaths of loyalty. Each clan bore a high sacred animal totem, representing their mythical origin and spiritual protectors. Symbols such as the wolf, the eagle, the horse, or the bear were not mere metaphors, but revered entities invoked in ceremonies of protection and war. These totems unified the clan both in battle and in belief, reinforcing their collective identity in a world shaped by uncertainty. At the heart of nomadic social organization was the tribal leader, typically chosen from among the most respected warriors, skilled strategists, and generous providers. Authority was not automatically inherited, but earned through heroic deeds, leadership in battle, and the fair distribution of spoils. A good leader, or khanma, was one who could maintain a balance between power and consensus, offering protection and stability in exchange for loyalty. However, such leadership was constantly challenged. A crisis, a military defeat, or an internal betrayal could quickly ignite violent struggles for control. Succession was never guaranteed, and brothers, cousins, or even sworn comrades could become mortal enemies overnight. The clan's internal hierarchy was based on merit, but also on tradition. Elders had weight in collective decisions, shamans held symbolic and spiritual power, and warriors formed the backbone of society. There was no clear distinction between civilian and soldier. All men were trained from youth in warfare, hunting, and horsemanship. Women, though often assigned to domestic and ritual roles, could also wield influence. Some even led tribes, or played decisive roles in alliances and diplomacy. Marriage was more than an emotional union. It was a political tool. Daughters were promised to seal treaties, build bridges between clans, or prevent wars. The tribal economy was simple, yet effective. Based on white nomadic pastoralism, subsistence came from livestock, especially horses, sheep, goats, yaks, and camels. Milk was transformed into cheese, yogurt, and the famous fermented mare's milk drink known as uiragre, a symbol of Mongol hospitality and identity. Dried meat sustained long journeys, and leather was used for clothing, tents, and armor. The tribes also produced metal goods, composite bows, saddles, and tools, trading with caravans that crossed Asia, or with neighboring civilizations such as the Chinese and Turks. In times of scarcity, when diplomacy failed, they turned to swift raids against rival clans or foreign settlements. The religion that unified these peoples was Tengrism, a worldview centered on Tengri, the god of the eternal sky, master of destiny and universal order. Tengri was not a god of temples, but of horizons. His worship was silent, inward, and often mediated by shamans, men and women capable of entering trances, communicating with spirits, and guiding the living in their most important decisions. Shamanic ceremonies involved dancing, throat singing, and the use of ritual objects such as drums and mirrors. Beyond Tengri, they also worshipped the spirits of the earth, ancestors, and animals, always seeking harmony with nature, whether in war, hunting, or judgment. War was a constant. The harsh environment and the struggle for fertile pastures made military incursions a cyclical necessity. Each tribe had elite warriors trained to shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. They used tactics of ambush, feigned retreat, siege, and blockade, many of which would later be inherited and expanded by the future Mongol imperial forces. Tribal battles were brutal, often ending in the extermination of entire families, absorption of the defeated, or the capture of livestock and women. The main weapons were the recurved bow, short spear, curved knives, and armor made of lacquered leather or iron. This society of autonomous clans and nomadic warriors seemed destined to endlessly repeat its cycle of internal wars, fragile alliances, and migratory movements. It was a system resistant to centralization and inherently suspicious of absolute power. Yet growing external pressures, such as the expansion of Chinese and Muslim empires and the rising ambitions of certain leaders, began to shift the balance. Within this seemingly fragmented world, the idea of something greater began to take root: unification. And that idea, dangerous and unprecedented, would take form in a young orphan named Temujin, who would learn how to transform personal loyalty into a national structure and how to forge armies out of clans. Tribal Mongolia was about to give way to the largest contiguous empire in history. The birth of Temujin, who would later become known as Genghis Khan, occurred around the year 1162, somewhere in the remote steppes of Mongolia, near the Onon River. At that time, no one could have imagined that this frail and silent boy, born into a minor and unstable clan, would one day unite centuries-old rival tribes and lead his people to dominate half of the known world. His birth name, Temujin, was given in honor of a Tatar warrior his father had defeated in combat. It was a powerful name, tied to victory and the fury of war, perhaps a sign of the destiny that awaited him. Temujin was the son of Yesugei, a respected leader of the Borjigin clan, and Hoylan, a woman kidnapped from another tribe and forced to marry Yesugei, a common practice among nomads of the time. Yet Hoylan became a central figure in the boy's upbringing. Intelligent, stern, and strategic, she instilled in her son a code of honor, resilience, and pragmatism that would shape the essence of the future emperor. Temujin's childhood, however, was far from stable or comfortable. Shortly after his birth, Yesugei was poisoned by Tatar rivals, leaving the family abandoned and cast out by the rest of the clan, who refused to recognize the authority of a fatherless child. The social fall was brutal. From the heir of a tribal leader, Temujin was reduced to living as an outcast, surviving with his mother and siblings by hunting rats, fishing, and digging up roots in miserable conditions. This early exclusion from the tribal structure taught him profound lessons about distrust, self-reliance, and the value of selective alliances. It was an environment where every grain of food required cunning, and every act of kindness could conceal a trap. It was also during this period that Temujin began to understand that power was not a birthright, but something earned, and that maintaining dignity amid abandonment required rare inner strength. Despite the hardship, Temujin grew into a disciplined, observant, and quietly determined youth. He learned to ride and hunt from a young age, mastering the art of fighting with precision and cunning. As a teenager, he was captured by a rival clan and imprisoned with a heavy wooden collar around his neck, humiliated before the elder warriors. But he escaped. That escape became his first victory, a small triumph against a fate that had seemingly sealed his ruin. Temujin never forgot his captors, nor the former allies of his father who had abandoned him. He kept everything in silence, like one gathering gunpowder before the explosion. As he grew, he began forging alliances with key tribal figures, offering selective loyalty and strategic rewards. One of his earliest important alliances was with Togrul, leader of the Khanates clan, who welcomed him as an adopted son. Another was with Jamuka, a childhood friend who would become his greatest rival. For a time, they dreamed of unifying the clans together, but eventually, they diverged in their methods and visions. Jamuka represented the traditional tribal aristocracy, while Temujin believed in promoting leaders based on merit, not just lineage. This ideological split between them reflected the tension between the old tribal world and the new kind of order Temujin sought to create. Beyond political alliances, Temujin also understood the power of family as a strategic nucleus. He married Borte, a young woman from the Ongirat clan, sealing a vital alliance with an influential tribe. Borte would become an essential figure in his life, not only as wife but as counselor, symbol of loyalty, and later mother to the sons who would inherit his empire. But even this bond was tested early on, when Borte was kidnapped by a rival clan. The rescue operation led by Temujin not only brought her back, but also solidified his reputation as a fearless leader, capable of acting with calculated brutality, two traits that would define him for life. Temujin's youth was a forge of iron. Pain shaped his mindset. Betrayal taught him caution. Abandonment showed him the importance of loyalty. And above all, the instability of the steppes taught him that true power lay not in inheritance, but in the ability to unite people under a purpose stronger than blood ties. He grew in silence like an exiled wolf, planning not merely to survive, but to dominate. And as his reputation grew among the nomadic clans, an unthinkable idea began to take shape, that a single man, born of a scorned origin, could gather all of Mongolia under his banner and transform it into a machine of conquest like the world had never seen. The unification of Mongolia under Temujin was not a sudden event, nor was it a smooth diplomatic process. It was a sequence of alliances, betrayals, strategic wars, and brutal decisions that required from him a unique combination of charisma, military intelligence, and survival instinct. At the time, the Mongol territory was an unstable mosaic of tribes constantly at war for resources, livestock, territory, and honor. No leadership was permanent, and treaties were as fragile as thin ice over a thawing river. It was in this landscape of instability and ongoing violence that Temujin began to carve out his rise, not just as a tribal chief, but as the architect of a new political order on the steppes. Temujin understood that power could not be sustained by brute force alone. His first strategy was to attract allies through meritocracy, a radical idea in a world where bloodline determined one's fate. He offered positions and rewards to those who followed him loyally, regardless of their origins. This drew in many orphaned warriors from defeated clans, nomadic merchants, craftsmen, and even members of lower castes who would never have had a voice among the traditional aristocracy. In this way, he began to form a devoted base of followers, building a personal army composed not just of soldiers, but of men who had everything to gain from his success and everything to lose if he failed. Temujin's early military engagements were localized, but decisive. He fought tribes like the Tatars, who had been accused of poisoning his father, and defeated them using tactics that combined speed, terrain knowledge, and surprise attacks. His use of horses as war platforms was masterful. His archers could fire with deadly precision while riding at full speed, something unprecedented for many of his enemies, who still relied heavily on close combat. Mobility and tactical discipline turned his small forces into surgical blades, capable of slicing through enemy tribal structures with near mathematical precision. One of his most pivotal moments was his conflict with his former friend and rival, Jamukha, who also sought to unify Mongolia, but by traditional methods. While Temujin promoted leaders based on merit, Jamukha upheld the old tribal aristocracy, distributing privileges based on lineage. Their confrontation was thus more than a territorial dispute. It was a clash of ideologies, a battle between the past and the future. In 1187, they faced each other with thousands of warriors. Although Temujin lost that first battle, his prestige did not vanish. On the contrary, the way he treated his allies and survived the defeat strengthened his image as a fair and persistent leader. Years later, in 1201, they would clash again. This time, Temujin emerged victorious. And the victory was brutal. He captured dozens of enemy leaders, and in a symbolic act of rupture with the old tribal world, executed many of them by boiling their heads in cauldrons. The message was clear. There would be no more room for disorder and betrayal in the steppes. Those who did not join him would be destroyed. This ruthless posture was accompanied by a legal code Temujin began to organize, later known as the Yasa, a kind of oral constitution based on discipline, loyalty, strict punishments, and respect for the order imposed by the Khan. Another of his revolutionary decisions was the creation of a standardized military system. Instead of relying on tribal lineages to form armies, Temujin divided his men into units of 10, Arban, 100, Zun, 1,000, Mingan, and 10,000, Tumen, mixing men from different clans. This eliminated primary loyalty to the tribe and replaced it with functional loyalty to the military unit, and ultimately to the Khan himself. This organization allowed him to mobilize forces quickly, create efficient command structures, and control his emerging empire with a firm hand. Each commander was responsible not only for leading, but also for ensuring the survival, conduct, and effectiveness of their men. The final victory came in 1206, when, at a great tribal assembly called a Kurultai, Temujin was officially recognized as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. That moment marked the end of the tribal world and the formal birth of the Mongol Empire. The once fragmented tribes now saw themselves as part of a nation in formation, with laws, an army, an administration, and a leader who unified their destinies under one sky. But this unification was not the end of Genghis Khan's dream. It was only the beginning. The new empire needed space, resources, and legitimacy, and that could only be achieved in one direction: outward. The war of unification ended, giving way to the war of expansion. With Mongolia unified, Genghis Khan turned his gaze south toward the wealthy kingdoms of China and west toward the vast cities of Central Asia. The time for survival had passed. Now began the time to conquer. The year was 1206. Winds swept across the plains of Mongolia, carrying the scent of freshly trampled grass and the reverent silence of a historic shift. After decades of battles, unstable alliances, bloody victories, and an unprecedented structural transformation of the steppe, the moment of consecration had arrived. In a vast gathering of tribal chiefs known as the Kurultai, the man called Temujin, the son of an outcast, the fugitive, the tireless warrior, was proclaimed Genghis Khan, a title that meant not just supreme leader, but something deeper and more symbolic: the sovereign of all who lived beneath the eternal blue sky. It was the formal recognition of a leadership long imposed by the sword, now consecrated by ritual and the forced consensus of the surviving tribes. The ceremony took place on the banks of the Onon River, the same river where Temujin had been born and which now witnessed his final rise as unifier of Mongolia. The setting was austere, like the steps that had shaped his people. There was no gold, no marble, no ornate temples. But there was something far more enduring, the symbol of a new power, born from the earth, from blood, and from belief in a destiny that now seemed inevitable. Clad in noble furs, surrounded by the chiefs of once fractured tribes now united, Genghis Khan raised his eyes to the sky and swore his oath not before distant gods, but under the direct gaze of Tengri, the eternal sky, the supreme Mongol deity. He did not see himself as a king by divine right, but as the one chosen by cosmic order to govern and reorganize the world. The consecration of Genghis Khan marked the official birth of the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous empire in human history. But his dominion was not just territorial. It was a shift in paradigm, the end of decentralized tribal structures, and the beginning of a mobile, highly efficient state with pragmatic administration, a disciplined army, and a global expansionist vision. Genghis Khan did not merely intend to control Mongolia, he aimed to control the known world. For him, war was a tool of order, justice, and the expansion of heaven's will. During that Kurultai, the foundational institutions of the empire were established. Genghis Khan reorganized the legal and military systems with even greater precision. The Yasa, the unwritten but strictly followed code of laws, was expanded. It covered rules on warfare, loyalty, punishment for betrayal, protection of diplomatic envoys, women's rights, the duties of generals, and battlefield conduct. It was a pragmatic code, merciless to transgressors, yet impressively effective in creating cohesion across a vast and culturally diverse empire. Genghis understood that to govern so many different peoples, he needed a universal rulebook, one that applied equally to nomads and sedentary subjects. He also established a mounted messenger system known as the Yam, which allowed the empire's center to communicate with its edges at astonishing speeds. This imperial courier network, based on relay stations set at regular intervals, would be vital for maintaining administrative and military cohesion. It would also serve as a system of espionage, diplomatic transport, and logistical coordination for campaigns. The Mongol Empire was being shaped as a living organism, with arteries, nerves, and a centralized command structure, something no other nomadic civilization had ever created before. Another major element of that coronation was the social reorganization. The old clans that had rebelled or remained neutral during the wars were dismantled, their names erased, their structures dissolved. In their place, Genghis Khan distributed new titles and lands to those who had proven their loyalty. This symbolic destruction of old tribal bonds was essential to consolidating a new Mongol imperial identity. For the first time, the inhabitants of the steppe began to see themselves not just as Merkits, Naimans, or Khanates, but as Mongols under one ruler. It was a radical reconstruction of collective identity, something unimaginable just decades earlier. But the most remarkable part of Genghis Khan's vision was not unification itself, but what he intended to do with it. He believed his mandate came directly from Tengri, and that his mission was to impose order on a disorganized world. To him, the neighboring kingdoms, plagued by corruption, dynastic rivalries, and cultural arrogance, were doomed to fall before an empire ruled by law, discipline, and the unbreakable will of its leader. China, Central Asia, the Islamic world, and even Europe were seen as chaotic realms in need of purification by the fire of Mongol conquest. It was not merely imperial ambition, it was an almost spiritual mission. With his coronation, Genghis Khan transformed Mongolia into a civilizational project. From that moment forward, every military decision, every campaign, every diplomat sent, and every city besieged would be a deliberate step in a systematic, planned expansion, one justified by a higher logic. The era of petty nomadic chiefs had ended. The era of the Khan of Khans had begun, the one who would make empires tremble, redraw maps, and etch his name into the memory of the world for centuries to come. The true strength of the Mongol Empire did not lie solely in the number of its warriors, but in the sophistication of its tactics, the flawless organization of its armies, and its absolute mastery of mobility. Genghis Khan had inherited the nomadic instinct to survive in hostile environments, but he transformed it into an art of war that broke with the known patterns of his time. Instead of castles and walls, the Mongols used open terrain as their battlefield and horses as an extension of their bodies. War for them was a living science, based on calculation, timing, silence, and speed. Direct combat was just one part of the equation. The secret was anticipation, surprise, and control of space. At the heart of the Mongol war machine was the light cavalry, composed of mounted archers trained from childhood to shoot in motion with devastating precision. Each Mongol warrior owned multiple horses, allowing for quick swaps during long marches, preserving the animals and keeping the army in constant motion. This reserve horse logistics gave the Mongols unmatched speed. They could cover distances of up to 150 kilometers per day, making them unpredictable, almost ghost-like on the map. The enemy never knew where they would strike or when, and when they appeared, it was already too late. The army's iconic weapon was the composite bow, crafted from layers of wood, bone, and sinew, glued under pressure and masterfully curved. Small and lightweight, but with a range of up to 250 meters, it allowed for powerful shots both up close and at a distance, piercing through leather and even light metal armor. Archer training began in childhood, and warriors could shoot forward, sideways, and even backward while galloping at full speed. This mastery of archery and horsemanship turned the battlefield into a hunting ground, where the enemy was constantly surrounded, exhausted, and destroyed with mathematical precision. Their tactical organization was also revolutionary. As previously mentioned, Genghis Khan divided his army into units of 10, Arban, 100, Zuun, 1,000, Mingan, and 10,000 warriors, 2 men, each led by officers chosen for merit and loyalty. This enabled not only strict discipline, but also an unprecedented ability to reorganize during battle. Each unit was trained to act autonomously or in coordination with others, giving the army extraordinary flexibility. The Tumans could split, encircle, retreat, or merge again without losing cohesion, as if they were limbs of a conscious organism. But the true genius of Mongol warfare lay in deception and the psychology of fear. Genghis Khan understood that it was not always necessary to kill all enemies. He only needed to break their will to fight. He employed tactics like the false retreat, in which his troops feigned panic and withdrawal to lure enemies into ambushes. He also used espionage and prior reconnaissance to map the logistical and emotional weaknesses of his opponents. In some battles, he placed dummies on extra horses to simulate a much larger force. In others, he scattered torches over miles at night to create the illusion of an endless army. Another key advantage was communication during combat. Flag signals, drums, and horns allowed orders to be transmitted quickly and precisely, even across great distances. Unlike many armies of the era, the Mongols did not fight in disorganized, compact masses. They operated in circular, diagonal, and mobile formations that allowed for encirclement, retreat, and simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts. Siege warfare was also part of their repertoire. Though nomads, the Mongols soon mastered Chinese and Persian war machines such as catapults, siege towers, and battering rams. They captured or bribed foreign engineers and integrated them into the army with respect and pragmatism. Discipline was absolute. Disobedience, cowardice, or desertion were punished by death, sometimes publicly to set an example. Yet merit was generously rewarded with land, spoils, and prestige. A common warrior could rise to the rank of commander if he proved his worth. And the rewards weren't only material. Receiving recognition from the Khan was a mark of immortality. Genghis Khan built an army where every man knew his place, his duty, and his value to the whole, and that made the system unbreakable. More than winning battles, the Mongols aimed to destroy systems of resistance. When a city surrendered without a fight, it was often spared. But if it resisted, the response was merciless. The city was razed, its leaders executed, and the survivors enslaved or killed. This reputation for terror preceded the Mongol army's arrival, causing many fortresses to surrender before seeing a single enemy. It was a war of movement, but also of symbolic communication. The Mongol white banner represented surrender and peace. The black banner meant total destruction. The enemy always had a choice, but the wrong choice meant extinction. Thus, with horses, bows, discipline, and carefully orchestrated tactics of terror, Genghis Khan built the most efficient military engine of his time. It was not merely a machine of destruction, but an extension of his vision, a tool to reorganize the world according to the will of the eternal blue sky. With this engine complete, the next step was inevitable: imperial expansion. Mongolia was only the beginning. Soon after consolidating his power in Mongolia, Genghis Khan turned his gaze beyond the steppes. The unification of the tribes was merely the first act of a greater project, to bring Mongol order to the rest of the known world, and the first chosen target was no accident. To the south and southwest of Mongolia lay the Xixia, a powerful semi-Chinese kingdom known for its technical knowledge, urban wealth, and strategic position. Controlling the corridor between the Gobi Desert and the Tibetan Plateau, the Xixia served as a commercial and military wall between Mongolia and the routes to China and Central Asia. To conquer them meant to open the gates for future imperial campaigns. Genghis Khan understood this with absolute clarity. The Xixia were of Tangut origin and had developed a unique civilization, blending Chinese, Tibetan, and Central Asian elements. They possessed walled cities, canals, advanced fortifications, and a well-trained army. Their emperor was known for his arrogance toward the Mongol nomads, whom he saw as undisciplined barbarians. But Genghis Khan did not seek recognition. He sought submission. In 1209, he launched his first major military campaign outside the unified borders, leading tens of thousands of cavalry into Xixia territory. It was the Mongol Empire's international debut, and it would be devastating. The campaign was marked by fast and brutal strategies. The Mongols, accustomed to open terrain, faced the complexities of deserts and walled cities with creativity. They surrounded the capital Yinchuan, diverted rivers to flood towns, and used psychological terror against civilians, creating panic and internal disorder even before breaching the defenses. Instead of rushing in with direct assault, Genghis Khan preferred prolonged siege, starving and terrifying the Xixia into surrender. In the end, the Tangut emperor submitted, agreeing to become a vassal of Genghis Khan. But this submission was only superficial, and the Khan knew it. Shortly after that initial victory, Genghis Khan turned his forces toward the region's most powerful kingdom, the Jin, who ruled over northern China proper. They were a sedentary empire, immensely wealthy, with large armies, massive fortresses, and a complex bureaucratic culture. But they were weakened by internal disputes and unprepared for the type of warfare the Mongols would unleash. In 1211, Genghis Khan's armies crossed the Great Wall of China, not to destroy it, but to bypass it, maneuvering around its fixed strongholds with fluid, mobile strategy. This was the beginning of the great campaign against the Jin dynasty, a war that would last more than 2 decades. Across the plains of Manchuria and the northern Chinese valleys, the Mongols applied their successful formula: speed, siege, terror, and intelligence. They plundered smaller cities to draw imperial forces into ambushes, destroyed supply lines, and won over minority peoples living under Jin rule. With each victory, Genghis Khan's prestige grew. More than that, the number of allies increased. Many Chinese generals and governors voluntarily submitted to the Mongols in exchange for retaining their power, or simply to survive. The war was not only military but symbolic. It represented the collapse of a millennia-old order before a new logic driven by the winds of the steppe. In 1215, after multiple campaigns and thousands of deaths, the Mongols captured Zhongdu, the Jin capital, now known as Beijing. The city, once a symbol of imperial Chinese stability, was looted, burned, and turned into a living reminder of what happened to those who resisted. But Genghis Khan did not take the throne. His goal was not direct administration. Instead, he appointed loyal subordinates, imposed tribute, restored order, and moved on. His mission was not to rule the conquered lands, but to continue conquering. He saw his armies as arrows shot by the sky, destined to strike every target fate placed before him. Despite the victories, the Xixia would again defy Genghis Khan, seizing the opportunity during his absence to break the terms of their submission. The response was immediate. Between 1226 and 1227, near the end of his life, the Khan returned to Tangut territory to eliminate the threat once and for all. The campaign was brutal. Cities were leveled, populations exterminated, the Xixia emperor executed, and the entire kingdom erased from the map. Genghis Khan made it clear that betrayal would not be tolerated, and that peace under his banner was always an imposed peace. The Xixia, once one of the most advanced cultures on China's western frontier, vanished from history as an independent people. Their lands were absorbed into the growing empire as a province under direct watch. This first major expansion had achieved two strategic goals. First, it showed the world that the Mongols were no longer merely united tribes, but an empire with a thirst for advancement. Second, it opened the gates for future campaigns into Central Asia, the Islamic world, and eventually Europe. The wars against the Shi, Xia, and Jin had transformed the Mongol army into a global combat force, one adapted to both desert and city walls, to siege and long marches, to diplomacy and annihilation. The empire was on the move. And the world was beginning to realize, far too late, that Genghis Khan was not a fleeting shadow of the steppe. He was a new kind of emperor, and his march had only just begun. The campaign against the Jin, one of the richest and most powerful empires in northern China, meant far more to Genghis Khan than a mere military victory. It marked the consolidation of a new geopolitical paradigm in Asia, the beginning of the collapse of millennia-old imperial structures before the nomadic, flexible and violent logic of the Mongols. The Jin dynasty of Jurchen origin had ruled northern China since the 12th century. With its capital in Zhongdu, today's Beijing, it possessed a sophisticated administrative machine, advanced irrigation systems, stone palaces, and a vast army. But what the Jin had in stability, they lacked in adaptability, and the Mongols, with their mobile armies, recurved bows, and brutal strategy, exposed this fragility with ruthless clarity. The first serious attack on the Jin began in 1211, after the Xixia had been partially subdued and reduced to temporary vassals. The Jin had provoked Genghis Khan not only with diplomatic insults, but with military actions, crossing the borders and threatening his newly secured trade routes. The Khan's response was methodical and ferocious. He divided his army into multiple mobile columns and invaded Jin territory with surgical precision. The Mongols' success lay in breaking supply lines, recruiting ethnic minorities within the Jin Empire, and launching rapid strikes. Mongol generals targeted peripheral cities to destabilize the defense network, isolate fortresses, and undermine the morale of the imperial army. The Jin, accustomed to slower and more formal warfare, found themselves disoriented by the Mongol style: war of movement, psychological terror, and a lack of fixed lines. Genghis Khan attacked not just cities, but also farms, postal routes, granaries, and aristocratic refugees. This destabilized the empire's economic base and triggered waves of refugees, causing widespread panic. The Mongols also used prisoners as human shields, captured Chinese engineers to operate siege machines, and improvised weapons from local materials whenever necessary. Their adaptability was their deadliest weapon. In 1214, fearing total annihilation, the Jin tried to negotiate peace. They agreed to pay tribute and cede territory. However, in a desperate attempt to preserve prestige, they decided to move the capital from Zhongdu to Kaifeng in the south, a maneuver Genghis Khan interpreted as betrayal. The response was swift. He resumed the offensive and ordered the siege of Zhongdu, which lasted for months. Historical records speak of famine, disease, and even instances of cannibalism inside the city. When it finally fell in 1215, the destruction was systematic. Mongol soldiers burned entire districts, massacred thousands, and looted everything they could carry. The fall of Zhongdu was a symbolic turning point. The heart of northern China reduced to ashes, proving that no center of power was safe. Even with Zhongdu destroyed, the Jin dynasty would survive for nearly 2 more decades, now based in the southern capital of Kaifeng. But their authority was broken. Provinces began acting autonomously, often negotiating directly with the Mongols. Genghis Khan, however, did not pursue the remaining Jin immediately. After conquering the north, he turned westward, toward the Khwarezmian Empire. This gave the Jin a temporary reprieve, but the dynasty was doomed. In 1234, under Genghis Khan's successors, the Jin were completely annihilated, crushed by a temporary alliance between the Mongols and the Chinese of the Song dynasty. The fall of the Jin represented the first complete collapse of a major sedentary empire at the hands of the Mongols. More than a military triumph, it was a rupture in the balance of power in East Asia. For the first time, steppe nomads were not just defeating Chinese empires, they were replacing them, taking their cities, trade routes, technologies, and administrators. Genghis Khan had no desire to become Chinese, but he understood the value of local expertise. He absorbed everything that worked: currency, writing, accounting, and bureaucracy. The nomadic conquerors were becoming rulers, and doing so with an efficiency that astonished even the most experienced Chinese diplomats. The victory over the Jin also opened the gates to the south. Now, the Mongol gaze turned toward the Song, who ruled the heart of China. But first, Genghis Khan wanted to consolidate power in the west, and there he would encounter a civilization just as powerful and proud: the Islamic world. The experience gained in China would be vital for the next campaign. Siege tactics, the use of captured engineers, and terror as propaganda would all be carried beyond the Central Asian mountains. The war against the Jin was not merely a territorial conquest. It was a full-scale rehearsal for the systematic destruction of empires. With the fall of Zhongdu and the weakening of the Jin dynasty, Genghis Khan had proven that no throne was safe. That distance, walls, and tradition were no obstacles to his march. War was now the empire's universal language, and China, which for millennia had dictated the course of Asian civilization, now became a subject of a new power. An empire without palaces, born of cold, galloping hooves and the arrow, and now teaching the world that order could rise from chaos, and that history, like the steppe horizon, was vast enough to be redrawn. If the conquest of China demonstrated the Mongols' power over ancient kingdoms and walled cities, the campaign westward, against the Khwarezmian Empire, revealed Genghis Khan's brutal capacity to respond to betrayal and redraw entire regions through pure devastation. The Khwarezmian Empire, also known as the Khwarezmian Empire, was a powerful Muslim state stretching across vast territories of Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and parts of Afghanistan and Kazakhstan. Highly urbanized, it dominated part of the ancient Silk Road, hosting cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, Nishapur, and Merv, true jewels of medieval Islamic culture, filled with mosques, libraries, palaces, and marketplaces. At first, Genghis Khan had no intention of attacking the Khwarezmians. On the contrary, he sought diplomatic and commercial relations. He sent ambassadors with caravans full of gifts, a clear signal of his desire to establish a peaceful and profitable exchange. But Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, ruler of the empire, saw this approach as a threat. Suspicious, arrogant, and poorly advised, he authorized the execution of the Mongol envoys and the plundering of the caravans, an act which, by the diplomatic codes of the time, was equivalent to a sacred declaration of war. For Genghis Khan, it was not merely a political or personal offense, it was a crime against the heavens. The response would not be diplomatic, it would be total. In 1219, Genghis Khan mobilized one of the largest armies ever seen and marched into the Khwarezmian Empire with surgical precision. He divided his forces into independent columns, each with a specific mission. Some advanced directly towards Samarkand, others crossed impassable deserts, and a force led by his sons flanked the enemy through unexplored routes. This tactical fragmentation completely disoriented the Khwarezmian generals, who expected a traditional frontal assault. Instead, they found themselves surrounded from every direction. The cities fell like dominoes, and the Mongols, already seasoned in siege techniques from their campaigns in China, applied them with ruthless efficiency. The city of Bukhara, a spiritual center of Islam, was one of the first to fall. Genghis Khan entered its central mosque on horseback, dismounted, and declared to the surviving population, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." This was more than a dramatic phrase, it was a declaration of purpose. He saw his mission as heaven's decree, a cleansing of the world through the fire of war. He then allowed the city to be looted, its leaders executed, and its population drastically reduced. But worse was yet to come. Samarkand, the jewel of the Khwarezmian Empire, attempted resistance. Strongly fortified with high walls and tens of thousands of soldiers, it presented a challenge worthy of Mongol force. But in addition to brute strength, the Mongols used clever siege engineering, catapults, tunnels, makeshift dams, and mobile towers. Within days, the city was isolated. Within weeks, it was vulnerable. When it finally fell, historical accounts speak of mass executions, systematic rape, and an almost ritualistic destruction of administrative centers. Every act seemed calculated not only to eliminate resistance, but to send a clear message. No civilization was beyond the reach of Mongol justice. Shah Muhammad fled from city to city, desperate, pursued by Mongol detachments that seemed omnipresent. He died in exile, alone and abandoned by his generals. But Genghis Khan was not satisfied. He ordered a relentless hunt for the Shah's sons and heirs, ensuring no fragment of power could reconstitute itself. His policy was clear: destroy the head, crush the limbs, and incinerate the roots. In doing so, the Mongols not only defeated the Khwarezmian Empire militarily, they erased it from the political map of history. The massacre at Nishapur is perhaps the most brutal episode of this campaign. After a Mongol general, allegedly Genghis Khan's son-in-law, was killed during the siege, a total revenge was authorized. It is said that over 100,000 inhabitants were executed, many beheaded and buried in mass graves. The exact number remains uncertain, but the psychological impact of this destruction was enormous. News of the massacres traveled faster than the armies themselves. Nearby cities surrendered at the first sight of Mongol banners, driven by sheer terror of what could come. Yet alongside the brutality, there was calculation. Genghis Khan understood that his Western campaign was not just a territorial war, it was a war of reputation. Every destroyed city served as a warning to dozens of others. Every massacre was an open letter declaring that resistance to the Khan meant extinction. At the same time, he preserved engineers, artisans, doctors, and scribes from conquered cities, relocating them within the empire, encouraging knowledge transfer, and strengthening his own administrative infrastructure. By the end of the campaign, between 1221 and 1222, what had once been the vast and proud Khwarezmian Empire was reduced to smoldering ruins, corpses, and silence. Genghis Khan had not only conquered land, he had shattered one of the Islamic world's greatest civilizations in a single campaign. It was a direct warning to the rest of the world. From China to Persia, there were no longer any untouchable zones. And more than that, it marked the beginning of Genghis Khan's march toward Europe, as his generals, such as Subutai and Jebi, would soon push into the Russian steppes and the Caucasus, testing the limits of an empire that had not yet learned to stop. The war waged by the Mongols was not merely a clash of swords, arrows, and walls. It was a psychological war, meticulously designed to induce panic, provoke surrender, and dismantle the collective will to resist. The use of terror as a strategic tool became one of the most feared trademarks of Genghis Khan's empire. For him, the complete destruction of a rebellious city was not just a military response, but a symbolic message to all potential adversaries. Resistance would be punished with oblivion. Among all examples of this extermination policy, the siege and massacre of Nishapur in 1221 remains one of the most brutal and emblematic episodes of his Western campaign. Nishapur, located in present-day Iran, was one of the most prosperous cities in medieval Persia. Renowned for its refined architecture, cultural centers, mosques, and theological schools, it was also a strategic point along the trade routes linking east and west. When the Mongol army approached, the city hesitated between surrender and resistance. At first it partially capitulated, but soon rebelled again after the death of Tokucha, a Mongol general and Genghis Khan's son-in-law, who was killed by an arrow shot by a defender of Nishapur during the occupation. Tokucha's death was seen as a personal affront, a direct blow to the honor of Genghis Khan's household. The response was absolute. The task of retaliation was entrusted to Tolui, the Khan's youngest son, with explicit orders: eliminate every possibility of future rebellion in that city. When the Mongols returned, they launched a total siege, not just militarily, but symbolically. They surrounded the city with fire, cavalry, and catapults, breaking down its gates with violence and advancing through its streets with lethal precision. After Nishapur fell, a systematic extermination began. Historical accounts, often exaggerated or contradictory, speak of up to 100,000 executions, though some Islamic sources suggest even higher numbers. It was not random slaughter. The Mongols ordered the methodical separation of the population. Men, women, and children were grouped, many beheaded in succession, buried in mass graves, or left to rot in the open as a warning sign. Libraries were set ablaze, artworks destroyed, and even the corpses were stacked at the city's edge as a macabre monument. The decision to completely destroy Nishapur was part of a broader policy. The Mongols did not wield terror out of rage or sadism, but as geopolitical strategy. They understood that the massacre of one city could break the morale of dozens of others. It was a blood investment that saved future battles. And more than fear, it fostered preemptive obedience. Cities well informed of what had happened in Nishapur began to see surrender as the only viable path to survival. Some even opened their gates and handed over their leaders before the Mongols had arrived. The logic was clear. Mercy was only extended to those who submitted immediately. Any hesitation was interpreted as hostility. Genghis Khan thus built a reputation that traveled faster than his horsemen. Terror was both sword and messenger. Tales of the massacres were deliberately spread, often amplified by traumatized survivors who fled to distant regions carrying stories of horror. And that was exactly what the empire intended, that the mere mention of Genghis Khan's name would send chills before it was even spoken aloud. Yet this same army that brought total destruction was extremely selective in preserving certain individuals and knowledge. After the massacres, the Mongols spared engineers, doctors, scribes, mathematicians, translators, and artisans. These specialists were relocated to central cities of the empire, where they contributed to the administrative and technological development of the Mongol state apparatus. Thus, while cities burned to the ground, knowledge was absorbed. Genghis Khan knew that conquering the world required more than destruction. It required reconstruction on new foundations, controlled by him. The case of Nishapur was just one of many. Other cities like Merv, Herat, Balkh, and Urgench faced similar fates, each marked by fires, mass executions, and the annihilation of entire social structures. In Urgench, for example, records say that Mongols resorted to killing prisoners manually with ropes because their swords had become dull from overuse. The horror was efficient, but also logistical. Soldiers received execution quotas, and prisoners were treated as tallies to be eliminated. This policy, barbaric yet functional, allowed Genghis Khan to expand his empire with speed and resource efficiency. It avoided prolonged campaigns, reducing the chances of organized resistance. Conquered territories became deserted regions, ready to be repopulated under new order. Terror was not chaos. It was short-term social engineering, shaping behaviors, defining loyalties, and redrawing cultural boundaries. By the end of this western phase of conquest, the Mongol Empire stretched from China to Iran, from the Kazakh steppes to the edge of Mesopotamia, and each conquered city served as both a geographic marker and a strategic ruin, whose rubble told a story. The story of an empire that used fear as a tool and destruction as language. A language that the world, from the Caucasus to Korea, was now beginning to understand with terrifying clarity. Around the year 1227, during the final push to annihilate the Xixia, Genghis Khan, the man who had transformed a handful of nomadic tribes into the largest land empire in history, died. His death, however, is shrouded in a dense veil of mystery, deliberate silence, and contradictory legends that have resisted the passage of time. Even after nearly 8 centuries, there is no definitive historical consensus on how, where, or exactly in what manner he died. What is known for certain is that his death was not immediately announced, and this detail alone reveals how sacred, strategic, and irreplaceable his figure had become in the Mongol imagination. The context was the second campaign against the kingdom of the Xixia, which had betrayed its alliance with the Mongols by refusing to participate in the war against the Khwarezmian Empire. Genghis Khan considered this refusal an act of rebellion. Despite his age and deteriorating health, he launched a campaign of extermination against the Tanguts, determined, methodical, and symbolic. He did not merely want to subjugate them, he wanted to erase the name Xixia from history. In the midst of this campaign, something happened. Chinese and Persian sources from the time offer different versions. Some claim he fell from his horse while hunting and suffered fatal internal injuries. Others suggest he was struck by a poisoned arrow or simply fell ill from natural causes. There are even more fantastical legends, such as one claiming he died during a forced sexual ritual with a Tangut princess, a tale widely dismissed but still repeated in parts of Central Asia. What all these versions share is secrecy. His death was kept absolutely secret for weeks, possibly months, until all battlefronts were under control. His generals and sons continued leading the armies as if the Khan was still alive, issuing orders in his name, coordinating looting and executions and finishing what he had started. The final destruction of Yinchuan, the Tangut capital, and the complete end of the Xixia dynasty, Genghis Khan, even in death, won his last war, a clear demonstration that the empire he had founded already had a functional structure capable of surviving without its physical creator. The location of his tomb is one of the greatest archaeological mysteries in the world. He reportedly requested to be buried in secret. No markings, no monuments, no chants, no glory, only silence. His men, honoring this wish, killed all who witnessed the funeral procession: peasants, soldiers, even the gravediggers. It is said that horses were made to march over the site to erase the traces of burial, and that thousands of trees were planted afterward to camouflage the area. Some reports point to the Khenti Mountains in Mongolia as the likely burial site. Others suggest more distant regions, including southern Siberia. Several modern expeditions have tried to find Genghis Khan's tomb using satellites, ground-penetrating radar, and forensic archaeology, but none has been conclusive. This deliberate disappearance was no accident. Genghis Khan knew that his death could trigger political instability, or worse, become the object of religious contention. By hiding his tomb, he also prevented it from becoming a site of worship, desecration, or symbolic dispute. His death had to be invisible, just as his childhood had been forgotten by the tribes. The Khan wanted his presence in the world to be eternal through the empire, not through a tomb. This alone shows how his mindset surpassed the common ambitions of kings and generals. He did not want to be remembered as a man, but as an inevitable force, a cosmic presence shaping history. After his death, leadership of the empire passed to his son Ogedei, following the succession plan established during his lifetime. The transition was organized, though not without tension among his brothers and descendants. Still, the legacy of Genghis Khan remained intact. Under his sons and grandsons, the empire would continue expanding for decades, reaching Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the whole of China. But none of them possessed the same combination of strategic genius, political pragmatism, and mystical aura as Genghis. He was not just the founder. He was the mold by which all others would be judged, and inevitably seen as pale extensions of his conquering spirit. Even today in modern Mongolia, Genghis Khan is more than a historical figure. He is a national symbol, featured on currency, monuments, airports, and public rituals. While many Asians view him as a hero, others remember him as a scourge, such as the Chinese, Persians, Arabs, Russians, and Hungarians, who suffered under his conquests. Yet regardless of the perspective, his death remains wrapped in silence, as if the world had never fully understood who he was. In life, Genghis Khan was the sound of thunder over the earth. In death, he became the eternal echo of the empty steppe sky. With the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, the largest contiguous empire ever built by human hands faced a decisive moment. How to maintain expansion, order, and coherence without the man who had fused war, politics, and divinity into a single body? The answer came through planned succession, something Genghis himself had meticulously organized in life. His third son, Ogedei Khan, was chosen as the principal heir, not for being the eldest, but for possessing the most balanced combination of authority, pragmatism, and administrative skill. When he formally assumed the title of Great Khan at a Kurultai, held in 1229, Ogedei became the new center of gravity for an empire that now stretched from Manchuria to Persia, encompassing multiple ethnicities, religions, and power systems. Ogedei was different from his father, less of a warrior, more of an administrator. Where Genghis operated with terror and speed, Ogedei preferred structure and continuity. His greatest achievement was consolidating the empire, transforming the conquest machine into a functional political and economic system. He established a fixed administrative center, Karakorum, which became the empire's first formal capital. Though modest compared to Chinese and Persian metropolises, Karakorum housed palaces, warehouses, courts, temples of various religions, and one of the most organized bureaucracies of the 13th century, where Chinese, Arab, and Uyghur scribes worked side by side. Ogedei's policy was one of continuity and expansion. His reign witnessed the greatest territorial growth ever recorded under the Mongols. While consolidating his father's conquests in Central Asia and northern China, he launched new campaigns against the southern Song Empire and against Slavic and Germanic civilizations to the west. Coordinating these campaigns required mobilizing tens of thousands of cavalrymen, supply caravans, relay stations, and messengers, all functioning in synchrony thanks to the Yam postal system, which he expanded with even greater efficiency. The logistical integration of the empire reached unprecedented levels, enabling orders issued in Mongolia to reach the borders of Hungary or the East China Sea within days. One of the greatest triumphs of his reign was the final destruction of the Jin Empire in 1234, ending the Jurchen presence in northern China. This victory solidified Mongol dominance in the region and paved the way for a future full-scale offensive against the Song. He also ordered the invasion of Korea, which, though never fully incorporated into the empire, was forced into submission and tribute. In the west, Ögedei relied on his most capable generals, like Subotai, to lead the campaigns against Russian principalities, Poles and Hungarians. These campaigns would later culminate in devastating battles like Liegnitz and Mohi, which spread panic across medieval Europe. But Ögedei was not merely a distant commander. He was deeply concerned with the economic stability of the empire. He encouraged trade, restored segments of the ancient Silk Road, founded markets, and welcomed the presence of Muslim, Chinese, and European merchants. He created standardized tax systems and introduced the use of paper money in some regions, inspired by the Chinese model. He also showed remarkable religious tolerance, allowing Buddhists, Nestorian Christians, Muslims, Taoists, and shamans to operate freely under his rule. He understood that the empire's diversity was its strength, but demanded absolute obedience to Mongol governance. However, his reign also revealed emerging internal problems. Loyalty among Genghis Khan's descendants began to fracture. Sons from other Mongol clans, such as those of Chagatai and Jochi, competed for territory and political influence. This tension would become the seed of future divisions into independent Khanates, like the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. These divisions remained under control during Ögedei's reign, but the seed of fragmentation had been planted. He tried to keep his brothers and nephews aligned through the distribution of tributes and honorary titles, a policy effective in the short term, but unsustainable in the long run. Ögedei's final years were marked by physical exhaustion and excessive alcohol consumption. Though admired for his administrative skill and political vision, he was also known for his indulgence. He died in 1241, possibly from liver complications, leaving behind an empire that, though still unified in theory, now depended on the skill of his descendants to maintain the delicate balance between expansion, control, and legacy. His death coincided with the peak of the Mongol campaign in Europe, which was abruptly interrupted to allow generals to return eastward for a new Kurultai to determine the next great Khan. The era of Ögedei was, therefore, the apex of the Mongol Empire as a unified functional structure. With him, the empire ceased to be merely a conquering force and began to operate as a complex, multicultural, multi-front and logistical imperial system. His territorial conquests were vast, but his greatest achievement was invisible: the consolidation of the conquered world. After his death, the era of internal disputes, geographic divisions, and succession conflicts would begin, slowly transforming the empire into a mosaic of interdependent kingdoms and eventually into dust. When the Mongol armies turned their gaze westward, Europe was utterly unprepared to comprehend, let alone resist, the force that approached. Until then, the Christian kingdoms of the region scarcely knew of the Mongols' existence. They were thought of as a distant, barbaric, and mysterious people, and few imagined that this empire of nomadic horsemen from the depths of Asia would cross thousands of kilometers of steppe and mountains to strike at the heart of medieval Europe. But that is exactly what happened. Under the command of General Subotai and Prince Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, the Mongols invaded the continent with a level of military precision that defied all known rules of warfare. What followed was a brutal clash between two civilizations governed by completely different logics. The first target was Eastern Europe, specifically the Russian principalities, which at the time were not a unified country, but a patchwork of independent feudal domains, often at war with each other. In 1237, the Mongols crossed the Volga River and attacked Ryazan, launching the campaign with the total destruction of the city. They then took Kolomna, Moscow, and Vladimir, devastating each with the same relentless rigor. The Russians' wooden fortifications were useless against the Mongol catapults. Local armies, made up of hastily assembled militias and heavy cavalry, were no match for the mobility and firepower of the steppe archers. The Mongols did not face resistance. They destroyed it before it had time to organize. In 1239 and 1240, it was Kiev's turn, the symbolic capital of Russian Orthodox Christianity. The city resisted for a few days, but soon fell into ruins. The population was massacred, churches looted and burned, and the survivors enslaved. The impact was catastrophic. Russia fell to its knees, its cities transformed into vassals of the Mongol Empire, forced to pay heavy tribute for decades. Thus began the foundation of the so-called Golden Horde, the empire's western arm, which would dominate Eastern Europe until the 15th century, influencing its politics, economy, and even the future structure of the Russian state. But the Mongols did not stop there. With Russia subdued, they turned their sights on Central Europe. In 1241, they crossed the Carpathians with multiple armies, advancing into Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, and Austria. Their strategy mirrored what they had used in Asia: speed, division of forces, and coordinated attacks. While one column marched on Krakow, another swept down the Danube. Christian forces tried to form emergency coalitions, but their armies were slow, poorly coordinated, and unaccustomed to fighting invisible enemies. The Battle of Liegnitz in April 1241 was a milestone in this collapse. There, an alliance of Polish, German, and Templar knights was surrounded and annihilated within hours. Their leaders were beheaded, and their skulls used as symbolic trophies. Just days later, the Mongols faced the army of King Bela IV of Hungary at the Battle of the Sajo River, also known as the Battle of Mohi. The Hungarians had built a makeshift fortification on the riverbanks, trying to use the terrain to their advantage. But Subutai executed a classic pincer maneuver. He feigned a frontal assault while his forces crossed the river via a secondary bridge overnight. When the final attack came, the Hungarians were trapped, crushed between two mobile columns. The massacre was total. The royal army was destroyed, thousands of soldiers killed, and the king himself barely escaped, fleeing barefoot to Vienna. Hungary was left in ruins, with dozens of cities sacked and entire regions depopulated. The Mongol advance into Europe seemed inevitable and unstoppable. Rumors spread like wildfire that the invaders were Asian demons, that they didn't sleep, that they ate raw meat and drank blood, that their arrival was a harbinger of the apocalypse. The panic sparked by this unknown war led the Pope to call for days of fasting, public penance, and prayers for salvation. But then, unexpectedly, the invasion stopped. In 1242, at the height of the European campaign, the Mongol armies began to withdraw. The reason? The death of Ögedei Khan in Karakorum. According to Mongol tradition, all princes of Genghis Khan's lineage had to return to Mongolia to participate in the Kurultai and elect a new great Khan. The internal discipline of the empire was so solid that not even the conquest of Europe could take precedence over dynastic duty. This withdrawal saved Western Europe. Many regions on the brink of invasion, such as Vienna, Lombardy, and even France, were spared from devastation. It was a historic reprieve, an accidental interval, but the trauma remained. From that moment on, Europeans began to take the Mongols seriously. They sent embassies, tried to understand who these steppe warriors were, and even sought diplomatic alliances, especially against Islam. Franciscan monks were sent to the court at Karakorum, and documents began to circulate in European monasteries, attempting to map the empire's structure and faith. The campaign in Europe was brief, but profound. In less than 5 years, the Mongols had completely altered the region's balance of power, destroying centuries-old structures, collapsing economies, and laying the foundations for a new Asian power at the heart of the continent. The Golden Horde, commanded by Batu Khan, settled in the southern Russian steppes and began to rule over the Slavic principalities with a firm hand. From there, the Mongol presence would become permanent, shaping not only the history of Asia, but also the trajectory of medieval Europe. By the mid-13th century, while Europe was still recovering from the trauma of the Mongol invasions, and China was restructuring under foreign rule, the Islamic world faced its own cataclysm. The ancient and majestic city of Baghdad, intellectual, spiritual, and economic capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, was about to become the next target of Mongol expansion. And this would not be just any attack. It would be an offensive that would change not only the political geography of the Middle East, but the very course of Islamic civilization itself. At the center of this historic moment stood Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, brother of the reigning Great Khan Monka, and commander of one of the most devastating campaigns ever seen on Persian and Arab soil. Baghdad, founded in the 8th century, was far more than just a capital. It was the center of an empire which, although politically weakened, still held enormous symbolic weight as the seat of the Sunni Caliphate. At the time, the Caliph, al-Mustasim, held spiritual authority that extended far beyond his dwindling material borders. Even in decline, Baghdad remained rich with libraries, universities, astronomers, theologians, mathematicians, and architects. It was, in essence, the beating heart of centuries of Islamic knowledge. But its intellectual grandeur was no match for the war machine that approached. Hulagu's mission was clear: to subjugate all independent Muslim powers in Western Asia, especially those that resisted or challenged Mongol authority. Among his targets were the assassins of Alamut in Iran and the Abbasid Caliphate. By 1256, he had already destroyed the Nizari Ismaili strongholds, including the legendary fortress of Alamut, ending the era of the infamous assassins. With that obstacle removed, he turned his attention to Baghdad. In 1257, he sent a letter to the Caliph demanding submission. The Caliph, confident in his spiritual prestige and the city's supposed invulnerability, refused to yield. The response was swift. Hulagu marched with a massive army composed not only of Mongols, but also of Turkish, Georgian, Armenian, and Persian troops, a plural and destructive force rarely assembled before. The siege of Baghdad began in January 1258. The city was unprepared. Its defenses were weak, its political leadership divided, and it had no significant external alliances. The Mongols, on the other hand, arrived with Chinese and Persian engineers skilled in siege weaponry, along with flawless logistical organization and siege tactics, honed over decades of conquest. They dammed the Tigris River, built ramps, launched incendiary projectiles, and breached the city walls with astonishing speed. In less than 2 weeks, Hulagu's armies broke through and the nightmare began. The sack of Baghdad was a civilizational tragedy. Estimates of the dead range from 100,000 to over 1 million people, including civilians, scholars, clerics, and administrators. Libraries, including the legendary House of Wisdom, were destroyed. It is said that so many books were thrown into the Tigris River that the waters turned black with ink and red with blood. The city burned for days. Mosques were desecrated, palaces dismantled, bridges broken. Caliph al-Mustasim was captured and, according to reports, executed by suffocation, rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, in keeping with the Mongol custom of not spilling royal blood. This symbolic execution was not merely vengeance. It was the annihilation of the spiritual center of Sunni Islam. The fall of Baghdad had repercussions that lasted for centuries. With the city's destruction, the Abbasid Caliphate ceased to exist as a real political power, surviving only as a ceremonial shadow in Mamluk Egypt years later. The destruction of the city's intellectual elite dismantled schools of thought, interrupted the transmission of knowledge, and created a deep cultural void. Many Islamic scholars came to see the Mongol invasion as divine punishment, a trauma that redefined the relationship between religion, power, and history across the Muslim world. Hulagu, in turn, would go on to found the Ilkhanate of Persia, one of the 4 major Khanates of the Mongol Empire, which governed the region with relative pragmatism for decades. Ironically, Hulagu's descendants would eventually convert to Islam, a historical twist that underscores the complexity of the Mongol legacy, a people who destroyed entire civilizations, yet also absorbed, transformed, and reorganized them under new forms. The Ilkhanate, despite its brutal origins, became a center of art, science, and cultural exchange between East and West. The siege of Baghdad was not just a military victory, it marked the end of an era. One of the greatest centers of learning and religious authority in human history was undone in a matter of days, and Islam entered a new phase, fragmented, without a central caliphate, and rife with internal disputes. At the same time, the Mongols had proven that no civilization was immune to collapse. They did not merely conquer, They redefined the world in their image. Baghdad, once a symbol of splendor, now stood as a burning reminder that the age of old empires had ended, and that from the Atlantic to the Great Wall of China, the world now lived under the long shadow of the Mongol ride. With the Central Asian steppes pacified, the Middle East reorganized under the Ilkhanate, and Eastern Europe dominated by the Golden Horde, the Mongols turned their attention to the last territory that still defied total conquest, southern China. There, the powerful and culturally refined Song dynasty resisted, heir to centuries of civilization with vast human and economic resources. To lead this monumental endeavor, the responsibility fell on Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, brother of Hulagu, and the future founder of one of the most remarkable political experiments in Chinese imperial history, the Yuan dynasty. Kublai was not merely a general, he was also a man of intellectual ambition, deeply interested in Chinese culture, systems of governance, and Confucianism. From an early age, he showed tendencies that distinguished him from other Mongol princes. He surrounded himself with Chinese advisors, studied classical doctrines of imperial administration, and understood that to rule China, it was not enough to conquer it with cavalry. He had to legitimize himself as an emperor according to local traditions, embracing the rituals, symbols, and responsibilities of the mandate of heaven. The war against the Song was long, exhausting, and unlike the blitzkrieg-style campaigns the Mongols had waged in Central Asia or Europe, the Song maintained a highly disciplined professional army, strong defensive lines south of the Yangtze River, access to the sea, and a densely interconnected urban infrastructure. They were also experts in naval warfare, an area in which the Mongols had almost no experience. To overcome these challenges, Kublai launched a long process of adaptation. He built fleets, strengthened alliances with southern tribes, and initiated a series of methodical sieges designed to isolate the Song in stages, slowly advancing into their territory without rushing into decisive battles. A key milestone in this campaign was the fall of Xiangyang in 1273, after nearly 5 years of siege. Victory was achieved with the help of Persian-made catapults brought from Central Asia and operated by Muslim engineers under Mongol command. With the city taken, the path to southern China was finally open. In 1276, the Mongols captured Hangzhou, one of the world's richest and most populous cities at the time, with little resistance. The Song emperor, still a child, was taken captive, and his surrender marked the political collapse of the dynasty. Only a handful of loyal officials remained, trying to resist by sea. The final victory came in 1279 at the Battle of Yamen, a naval engagement where the Mongols, by then adapted to maritime warfare, defeated the last Song fleet. The young emperor, driven to despair by his advisors, was forced to drown with his court. With that, all of China, for the first time in centuries, was unified under foreign rule. And more than that, it was now under Mongol rule, which had transformed into a Chinese imperial dynasty. Kublai, understanding the symbolic weight of this conquest, did not merely proclaim himself Great Khan. He adopted the title of Emperor of China and officially founded the Yuan dynasty in 1271. The Yuan dynasty was more than a political experiment. It was an attempt to reconcile Mongol traditions with Confucian bureaucracy, the practices of the steppe with the administrative demands of an agrarian and urban China. Kublai Khan moved the capital to Dadu, modern-day Beijing, where he built palaces, fortresses, canals, and markets. He maintained Mongolian as the language of the court, but preserved Chinese as the language of public administration. He promoted commerce, restored parts of the Silk Road, and created a unified tax system based on standardized tributes and population censuses. He also adopted paper money as the primary medium of exchange, placing China centuries ahead of the rest of the world in monetary policy. Kublai also became famous in the West thanks to the accounts of Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who spent nearly 2 decades in service to the Yuan court. His stories, often exaggerated or misunderstood, helped construct the image of the Great Khan as a benevolent, cultured, and extraordinarily powerful emperor, ruler of an empire that stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Caspian. Marco Polo described vast cities, organized roads, magnificent palaces, and a methodical government, an image that would enchant Europe for centuries and turn Kublai into something of a civilizational myth. But not all was harmonious. The Yuan dynasty faced constant tensions between the Mongol elite, and the Han Chinese population. Regional revolts, succession crises, and administrative failures rooted in ethnic favoritism. The attempted invasions of Japan, for instance, in 1274 and 1281, ended in disaster, marked by the legendary kamikaze or divine wind, which destroyed the Mongol fleets with devastating typhoons. These external failures began to erode the internal authority of the regime, which grew increasingly reliant on military cohesion and cultural suppression. Still, the creation of the Yuan dynasty was one of the most impressive feats in world political history, a nomadic empire that absorbed the largest and oldest agrarian civilization on Earth, adapted its structures, and governed its territory for nearly a century. Kublai Khan died in 1294, leaving behind not only an empire, but a model of governmental syncretism that would challenge the dichotomies between East and West, barbarian and civilized, conqueror and governed. Under his reign, conquest became governance, and the thundering charge of cavalry was transformed into a system. China, now ruled by a Khan, saw the blue skies of the steppe reflected over its rice fields. And the world once again learned that no civilization is too vast to be reshaped by the iron will of an empire on horseback. At the end of the 13th century, in a world already interwoven by trade routes, rumors, and wars, a young Venetian merchant crossed deserts, mountains, and unknown kingdoms, reaching the heart of an empire that, in the eyes of Europeans, seemed more fiction than reality. His name was Marco Polo, and his journey through the lands of the Mongol Empire not only changed his life but transformed the West's perception of the East for centuries. Under the rule of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the empire was at its organizational and cultural peak, and the presence of a European foreigner in its court reflected both the tolerance and the far-reaching scope of a power that saw itself as universal. Marco Polo left Venice as a teenager, accompanied by his father Niccolo and his uncle Matteo, both experienced merchants who had already traveled east on previous expeditions. The journey, which began around 1271, followed much of the ancient Silk Road, passing through Palestine, Persia, the Central Asian steppes, the deserts of Turkestan, and the high valleys of the Himalayas until reaching UN-dominated China. The crossing took 3.5 years and was fraught with dangers: bandits, extreme climates, disease, and inhospitable routes. Yet arriving at Xanadu, Kublai Khan's summer residence, was like stepping through a veil between two worlds. Upon reaching the Mongol court, Marco Polo was presented to Kublai Khan, who, according to the accounts, was deeply impressed by the young Venetian's intelligence, curiosity, and respectful manners. From then on, Marco was reportedly integrated into the empire's diplomatic and administrative corps, traveling across various regions of China and Asia in service to the Khan. For about 17 years, he supposedly served as an observer, messenger, and advisor, though the precise details of his role remain a topic of academic debate. What is certain is that Marco Polo gained access to a functioning empire, and his perspective was one from within, not from afar. In his later work, the famous Il Milione, dictated while imprisoned in Genoa years later, Marco Polo described with amazement the Chinese cities, public works, paper money, systematic use of coal, canals, spice markets, customs offices, marble palaces, and audiences with the emperor. He also described Buddhist ceremonies, the Mongol postal system, strict laws, imperial hunts, lavish banquets, mobile armies, and the religious coexistence of Buddhists, Muslims, Nestorian Christians, and Taoists. To European readers, these descriptions sounded like pure fantasy. The impact of Il Milione was immense. While many doubted its truthfulness, and even today, critics question certain passages, the book became one of the principal sources of information about the East during the Middle Ages. Its influence extended beyond literature. It inspired mapmakers, navigators, and dreamers. Among them, centuries later, was Christopher Columbus, who carried a copy of Marco Polo's book when he set out to find new routes to the Indies. The Venetian's account transformed Asia's image from that of a mythical, faraway land to a tangible territory, with organized cities, lucrative trade routes, and an efficient centralized power. But beyond the fascination, Marco Polo revealed an innovative geopolitical reality. The Mongol Empire was the first truly global imperial system. The routes were safe, languages coexisted, and the flow of goods, ideas, and people was more intense than ever before. The so-called Pax Mongolica, enforced by the fierce discipline of the armies and the logistical infrastructure of the empire, allowed European merchants to cross the continent and return alive, something unimaginable in the previous century. This stability enabled not only the trade of silk, porcelain, precious stones and gunpowder, but also the diffusion of techniques, inventions and cosmologies between once isolated worlds. However, it is important to note that Marco Polo's account was filtered through his Western upbringing and literary intentions. Much of what he observed was interpreted through Christian, commercial and aristocratic lenses. There are evident exaggerations, omissions and misunderstandings. Still, his testimony is valuable for showing how the Mongol Empire appeared to a foreigner who was not at war with it, but immersed in its mechanisms, not as an enemy, but as a guest and, by his own account, a personal friend of the Khan. Upon returning to Europe in 1295, after a long sea voyage through Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, Marco Polo brought not only spices and stories, but an entirely new mental map of Asia. His book was copied, translated, adapted, and read for generations. In doing so, it helped shape the European imagination of the East for centuries, contributing to both scientific curiosity and the rise of exploration and domination projects. The world Marco Polo saw no longer exists, but its memory, and that of the empire that welcomed him, lives on in the pages he dictated, in the routes he helped to chart, and in the enduring fascination with a civilization that, through the eyes of a Venetian, seemed to be the center of the universe. Despite the image often associated with the Mongols as brutal conquerors, mounted on horseback, and driven by a thirst for destruction, the true secret of the longevity and efficiency of their empire lay in their surprisingly pragmatic, adaptable and sophisticated administrative capacity. The same force that destroyed Baghdad, razed Kiev and subjugated China was not content with domination by the sword alone. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his descendants, the Mongols built a system of governance that enabled control over vast and culturally diverse territories, uniting regions from Siberia to Vietnam, from Korea to Hungary, under a single functional logic. One of the most impressive pillars of this system was the Mongol Imperial Postal Service, known as the YAM. It was a vast relay network of stations set up along the empire's main routes. Every 30 to 40 kilometers, there was a post equipped with fresh horses, food, maps, and in some cases lodging. Official couriers could travel up to 400 kilometers a day, switching mounts at each post. This structure allowed for rapid and efficient internal communication, ensuring that orders from the Great Khan reached the farthest corners of the empire quickly. In addition to delivering messages, the YAM also functioned as a system for espionage, oversight, and strategic military movement, turning commercial routes into logistical arteries of the state. The collection of taxes and tributes was another central feature of Mongol administration. Rather than impose a standardized system foreign to local customs, the Mongols preserved existing fiscal codes in each region, adapting them to the imperial framework. In China, the agricultural tax system was maintained with modifications, while in Islamic territories taxes based on trade and urban property continued. They appointed local administrators, often Muslims, Chinese or Armenians, and oversaw the process through population censuses and detailed registries. This strategy ensured not only efficient revenue collection, but also minimized rebellions by respecting traditional fiscal practices. Curiously, one of the most notable characteristics of Mongol governance was its active religious tolerance. Genghis Khan, though personally a follower of Tengrism, the traditional steppe belief, never imposed his faith on conquered peoples. His successors expanded this policy even further. Buddhists, Muslims, Nestorian Christians, Taoists, and Jews all coexisted under the same empire. In many regions, religious leaders were exempt from taxation, and their temples or churches were legally protected. This freedom was not merely benevolent, it was strategic. By allowing each people to retain their faith, the Mongols reduced cultural resistance and gained spiritual allies who helped maintain order. At the Yuan court, for example, Tibetan Buddhist monks, Taoist scholars, Muslim imams and Nestorian priests all coexisted, had access to the palace, and influenced government decisions. In Karakoram, the empire's capital before Beijing, temples of various religions stood side by side, and theological debates were encouraged as a form of intellectual exchange. This multi-confessional coexistence was rare, if not unheard of, in the medieval world, where most empires imposed an official religion. For the Mongols, political loyalty and social order mattered more than the spiritual content of beliefs. Mongol administration also stood out for its promotion of long-distance trade. They restored and protected the Silk Road, minted copper and paper currencies, standardized weights and measures, issued special passports called paisa, which granted free movement throughout the empire, and provided armed protection for trade caravans. Venetian, Armenian, Chinese, Persian, and Sogdian merchants crossed the continent with unprecedented safety. This commercial flourishing generated wealth, cultural exchange, and the transfer of technologies, such as the spread of paper, the compass, gunpowder, and agricultural and medical techniques across continents. However, Mongol governance also imposed strict laws and harsh punishments. The Yasa, a set of unwritten laws established by Genghis Khan, regulated everything, from military conduct to civil rights. Theft, desertion, adultery, and treason were punishable by execution. On the other hand, meritocracy was encouraged. Soldiers who showed bravery could rise to officer ranks. Loyal merchants were rewarded. Even conquered peoples could ascend socially if they proved useful to the system. This logic of administrative pragmatism, though harsh, created a predictable environment, essential for maintaining control over such a vast and diverse empire. With all this, the Mongol Empire became a uniquely structured political entity in history, where cities could flourish under the protection of nomadic warriors, and the known world became more interconnected than ever. The efficiency of the postal system, the fluidity of trade, religious coexistence, and fiscal stability were the pillars that sustained not only the expansion, but also the governability of a global empire long before modern globalization. But even this system, so well designed and strategically constructed, would begin to show cracks. As the Khanates gained autonomy and Kublai's successors vied for power, internal tensions increased. Mongol administration, however advanced, relied on the symbolic unity of the empire. And when that unity began to crumble, the system that once connected the world began to collapse with it. During the 13th and 14th centuries, under the rule of the Mongol Empire, the legendary Silk Road reached its highest level of integration and security in all of antiquity and the Middle Ages. This complex network of land routes and maritime paths linking the Far East to the Mediterranean basin was never truly a single road, but rather a tangled web of commercial, diplomatic, and cultural routes that crossed deserts, mountain ranges, plains, and oasis cities. Under Mongol administration, this web became a coordinated and protected logistical system governed by a central authority, which enabled the circulation of goods, information, and people on an unprecedented scale. It was a time when a merchant could travel from Hangzhou, China, all the way to mighty Venice, passing through dozens of cultures, languages, and currencies, all under the shadow of the same imperial banner. Traditionally seen as warriors and conquerors, the Mongols quickly understood the value of tatting commerce as a tool of power. Although they were a nomadic people, their geopolitical vision was highly strategic. After conquests, they would swiftly re-establish interrupted trade routes, rebuild bridges and caravanserais, protect markets, and encourage local commercial elites to operate under their protection. Cities such as Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, Tabriz, Hormuz, Aleppo, and Constantinople became vital nodes in this system. Trade flourished with the transportation of silk, jade, gold, ivory, perfumes, spices, manuscripts, precious stones, exotic textiles, gunpowder, musical instruments, and even slaves. In return, Mongol horses, livestock, weapons, carpets, and leather goods crossed borders heading south and west. But it wasn't only material goods that circulated. The Silk Road under Mongol control became a channel for ideas, religions, technologies, and diseases. Buddhist missionaries, Sufi mystics, Jewish traders, and Christian priests moved freely across the empire, spreading doctrines, translating sacred texts, and promoting cultural dialogues. Chinese artifacts reached Europe. Persian inventions spread across China. Astronomy, medicine, and mathematics traveled between Middle Eastern universities and Far Eastern courts. The compass, paper, printing, and fireworks are just a few examples of Chinese technologies that, thanks to the contact facilitated by the empire, spread across the Islamic world and later to Europe. However, Mongol control of the Silk Road was not an altruistic gesture. It was a tool for systematic control and espionage. The relay stations and the Yam postal system were used not only for transporting goods, but also for gathering intelligence. Reports about enemy troop movements, rumors of local uprisings, secret alliances, and flows of gold passed through this system and were centralized in Karakoram or Dadu. Foreign merchants, though welcomed, were constantly monitored, and many of the official traders, especially Armenians, Sogdians, and Muslims, also served as informants for the Mongol state. In this way, the empire maintained surveillance over its own routes, turning each caravan into a link between profit and politics. Moreover, the Mongols themselves controlled key trade points through state monopolies and selective tax incentives. In some sections, merchants received tax exemptions if registered as imperial collaborators. In others, only traders connected to the Khan's families could operate with full freedom. This system fostered loyalty among local economic elites while simultaneously filling the state's coffers. Cities that rebelled had their markets shut down or rerouted in favor of more submissive neighboring towns. Commerce was both a reward and a punishment, an ally and a weapon. At the height of the Powitz and Pax Mongolica, it was possible to travel over 12,000 kilometers of nearly uninterrupted territory under a single imperial authority, with standardized laws, valid passports, paisas, recognized currencies, and protection guaranteed by Mongol garrisons. This stability attracted Europeans like Marco Polo, but it also deeply influenced the Islamic and Hindu worlds, and it was this system that enabled the first great wave of globalization in pre-modern history. Not only did fabrics and porcelain reach Europe, but so did ideas, maps, navigational instruments, and narratives that would later transform science and religion. However, this very system also carried its vulnerabilities. The accelerated mobility of people and goods facilitated the spread of epidemics, and it was along these routes that, decades later, the Black Death would travel from Central Asia to the Black Sea and into Europe. The same caravans that carried silk and cinnamon also transported rats, fleas, and bacteria. The interconnection built by the Mongols, so effective for trade and culture, would also become the vector of the greatest pandemic of the medieval world, a tragic side effect of a highly functional system. Over time, as the four great Mongol Khanates, Yuan, Ilkhanate, Golden Horde, and Chagatai, became more autonomous and increasingly competitive, the unity that sustained the Silk Road began to fragment. Tributes were demanded in duplicate. Local disputes arose. Civil war among branches of the dynasty made previously safe roads dangerous. What had been the connective axis of three continents began to revert to a mosaic of insecure sections, pillaged by warlords, local invaders, or even former Mongol generals. Even so, the legacy of the Mongol era on the Silk Road remains undeniable. For about a century, the ancient world experienced its greatest period of cultural, commercial, and political interconnection. A time when the distance between Venice and Beijing was measured in months, not in myths. An era when a merchant, monk, or astronomer could cross deserts and mountains without needing to change legal language because the empire provided continuity. It was a singular, rare, and powerful experience, and perhaps for that very reason a fleeting one, because the stability born from conquest has an expiration date, and the Silk Road, so vibrant under the gallop of the Mongols, would soon fall silent under the disputes that followed. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, he left to his sons and grandsons not only the largest contiguous empire in history, but also a profound structural dilemma. How to govern such a vast, diverse, and decentralized territory? The answer, devised during his lifetime, was to divide the empire into administrative regions among his direct descendants. Initially, this measure worked as a practical solution. Each branch of the Khan family would receive a specific territory to administer with relative autonomy, but under loyalty to the great Khan in Karakoram, or later in Dadu, Beijing. However, as successors passed away and new generations grew with ambitions of their own, What began as a functional federation gradually turned into an empire fragmented by internal rivalries. Thus were born the four great Mongol Khanates. The first and westernmost was the Golden Horde, also known as the Kipchak Khanate, established in the steppes north of the Caspian and Black Seas. Founded by Batu Khan, Genghis's grandson and leader of the campaigns against Russia and Eastern Europe, the Golden Horde controlled the vast plains of what is now Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and parts of Hungary. With its initial capital at Sarai on the banks of the Volga River, this Khanate subdued the Russian principalities for centuries. There, local princes paid heavy tributes, but retained a degree of internal autonomy. The Golden Horde became a culturally hybrid power, influenced by Islam, shamanism, and Orthodox Christianity, acting as a bridge between the Mongol and Slavic worlds. Further south emerged the Ilkhanate of Persia, founded by Hulagu Khan, brother of Kublai and the conqueror of Baghdad. With its capital first in Tabriz and later in Sultania, this Khanate encompassed Iran, parts of Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and even the Caucasus. Though brutally established, the Ilkhanate quickly became a center of cultural refinement and Islamic integration. After decades of resistance and rejection by the Muslim population, the Ilkhans eventually converted to Islam, assimilated local elites, and promoted Persian art, astronomy, and Islamic architecture. Its administration was structured, and its courts gathered scientists, theologians, and artists of various backgrounds. It was perhaps the most Persian of the Khanates, though it still retained strong elements of Mongol military tradition. At the heart of Asia emerged the Chagatai Khanate, territory assigned to Genghis Khan's second son, Chagatai. It stretched from Transoxiana, modern Uzbekistan, to eastern Turkestan, Xinjiang, covering central regions of the Silk Road trade routes. This was the most difficult Khanate to govern due to its ethnically diverse populations, Turkomans, Uyghurs, Sogdians, and Chinese, and its geography, ranging from arid steppes to nearly impassable mountains. Over the centuries, the Chagatai Khanate oscillated between traditional military nomadism and unsuccessful attempts at sedentarization and Islamic conversion. It eventually became one of the most unstable regions of the former empire, but also a zone of intense linguistic and cultural fusion, producing unique dialects and art forms. Finally, in the Far East, the richest and most populous portion of the Mongol Empire was transformed into the Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan after the conquest of China. Ruling as emperor, Kublai broke with the tradition of subordination to the Great Khan and declared himself the sole legitimate sovereign of the entire empire, triggering tensions with his relatives in the other Khanates. The Yuan capital, Dadu, now Beijing, became the most advanced administrative center in the world, blending Chinese, Mongol, and Persian governance techniques. Tibetan Buddhism received significant patronage, and politics were conducted by a mixed elite of Mongols and non-Han Chinese. The Yuan dynasty lasted until 1368, when it was overthrown by the Chinese revolt led by Zhu Yuanzhang, founder of the Ming dynasty. The coexistence of these Khanates was ambiguous and often unstable. In times of need, they cooperated, such as during wars against the Mamluks or through commercial exchanges. But in other moments, they competed for trade routes, prestige, and control over Genghisid lineage. Each Khanate considered itself the legitimate heir to Genghis Khan's legacy, and none willingly acknowledged the authority of the others. Over time, the formal ties to the Great Khan became merely symbolic. The courts of Sarai, Tabriz, Samarkand, and Dadu began operating autonomously, with their own calendars, currencies, administrative languages, and foreign policies. This fragmentation gradually weakened the empire as a political unit. The Pax Mongolica, which had enabled secure trade routes and cultural interconnection, began to unravel. Borders became unstable, succession disputes more violent, and international trade more vulnerable to raids and overlapping taxes. At the same time, local cultures began to absorb the Mongols, rather than the other way around. In a matter of centuries, the conqueror's descendants had become Persian princes, Muslim khans, Slavic lords, and Sinicized emperors. What remained of cohesion was the shared memory of their steppe origins, but this memory was increasingly symbolic rather than a practical guide. The emergence of the four great Khanates thus marked the beginning of the end of Mongol imperial unity. They preserved Genghis Khan's legacy in different forms, as tradition, as myth, as identity, but no longer functioned as parts of a single body. The empire had become a political archipelago, and each island was starting to follow its own tide. Soon, internal and external winds would blow stronger, and not even the fastest horses would be able to reconnect what time and power had divided. The Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan in 1271, marked the height of Mongol domination over China. But it also marked the beginning of a slow and inevitable process of deterioration, social tension, and internal decline that would culminate less than a century later in a devastating national uprising. While the Mongols had conquered China with speed and military strategy, they would gradually lose control, stifled by their own ethnic rigidity, their difficulties adapting to a sedentary empire, and above all, the silent but persistent resistance of the Han majority, which never fully accepted foreign rule. The fall of the Yuan dynasty in 1368, led by peasants and monks, would not only signal the end of Mongol rule in East Asia, but also the restoration of China under Chinese hands, ushering in the powerful Ming dynasty. From the last years of Kublai's reign, the Yuan dynasty faced chronic challenges. The empire was vast but politically fragmented. Its administration depended on a Mongol minority elite, supported by Muslim, Tibetan, and some Sinicized Chinese bureaucrats, who formed an upper caste above the Han majority. This rigid ethnic structure generated deep resentment. The Han population was forced to pay higher taxes, barred from occupying top government positions, and frequently subjected to humiliation and repression. Social stability was maintained through force and propaganda, but the foundation of the empire was growing increasingly unstable. The situation worsened with a series of natural disasters, catastrophic flooding of the Yellow River, prolonged droughts, disease outbreaks, and famine. These events were interpreted by many Chinese as celestial signs that the Mongols had lost the mandate of heaven, the traditional concept that legitimized imperial authority in the Confucian worldview. Simultaneously, growing military expenses, especially after failed campaigns against Japan and uprisings in peripheral regions, drained the state's coffers. Paper currency, once efficient, began to devalue continuously, causing inflation and economic collapse. Amid this chaotic environment, popular movements with religious and nationalist foundations began to emerge, many influenced by messianic Buddhist doctrines and the secret traditions of the White Lotus. One of the most significant was led by Zhu Yuanzhang, a young orphaned peasant who became a Buddhist monk and later a military commander of a fast-growing resistance movement. Gifted with political intelligence and military skill, Zhu managed to unite various rebel factions and transform the struggle not just into a war against Yuan tyranny, but into a project to reclaim Chinese identity. Between 1351 and 1368, the rebellion expanded as cities were seized, garrisons destroyed, and local administrations replaced by insurgent governments. In 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang declared himself emperor, founding the Ming dynasty. Under the title Emperor Hongwu, he marched on Dadu, the Yuan capital, forcing the last Mongol rulers to flee northward to the steppes of Inner Mongolia. The city was renamed Beiping, later Beijing, and the foreign dynasty was officially ended. What began as a peasant revolt turned into a national revolution, ending over 90 years of Mongol rule over China. But the fall of the Yuan dynasty was not merely a change of elites. It was an ideological, symbolic, and cultural transformation. The Yiming undertook an extensive program of re-Sinicization. They abolished Mongol privileges, restored Confucian imperial examinations, rebuilt traditional governmental structures, and launched a systematic campaign to erase the legacy of the Yuan dynasty. At the same time, they reignited national pride, promoting public works, agricultural incentives, a restored bureaucracy, and tax reform. Mongols who remained in Chinese territory were gradually assimilated, expelled, or persecuted. However, the fall of the Yuan did not erase its legacy. China had been deeply transformed under Mongol rule. The introduction of new postal systems, regular use of paper money, reorganization of administrative regions, and increased contact with the Islamic and European worlds left lasting marks. Furthermore, the Yuan collapse did not signal the end of Genghisid influence. the Mongols retreated north and continued to exist as the Northern Yuan, or Northern Khanate, resisting for another century until their final subjugation. Their continued presence, though diminished, served as a reminder that the winds of the steppes could rise again. The Chinese revolt against the Yuan dynasty exposed a fundamental weakness of the Mongol Empire: the difficulty of maintaining sovereignty over sedentary, culturally distinct and politically organized populations, especially when rule was upheld by a tiny ethnic minority. The military superiority that had ensured their initial dominance was no match for political erosion, economic failure, and symbolic disconnection. And so, what Genghis Khan had conquered on horseback, his descendants lost under the weight of bureaucracy, cultural contempt, and popular discontent. The Mongol world began to contract, and China, reborn under the Ming, would take upon itself the mission of restoring order, reconnecting with its past, and at the same time projecting a new future, now once again under the gaze of its own gods and ancestors. The Ilkhanate of Persia, founded by Hulagu Khan after the destruction of Baghdad in 1258, was one of the most ambitious and culturally vibrant of the Mongol Khanates. Established over the ruins of the Abbasid Caliphate, the Ilkhanate encompassed vast regions that today include Iran, Iraq, parts of eastern Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Anatolia. At its founding, it was brutal, a militarized arm of the Genghisid machine aimed at controlling the heart of the Islamic world. But over the decades, the Khanate transformed into a center of refinement, religious adaptation, and cultural synthesis, where Persians, Mongols, Arabs, and Armenians coexisted under a new order. This coexistence, however, would not last forever. The combination of civil wars, dynastic crises, economic pressures, and external threats led to the irreversible disintegration of the Ilkhanate by the end of the 14th century. In its early years, the Ilkhans maintained the classic Mongol model of governance: strong military presence, centralized administration, strict taxation, and control over trade. But unlike their relatives in China and Russia, the rulers of Persia quickly understood that to govern stably, they needed to embrace the culture of the people they had conquered. The conversion to Islam, initiated by Ghazan Khan in the late 13th century, marked a turning point. By adopting Sunni Islam, Ghazan not only secured legitimacy with the Persian majority, but also drew closer to the religious and administrative elites, who began to integrate into the imperial bureaucracy. This policy of integration bore fruit. Under Ghazan and his brother Oljetu, the Ilkhanate flourished. Palaces, libraries, observatories, and universities were built. The city of Sultaniye became one of the most dazzling capitals of the era, with monumental domes and mosques that blended Mongol, Persian, and Islamic styles. Trade thrived along routes connecting India, the Caucasus, and the Mediterranean. Persian art, already sophisticated, gained new vitality under the patronage of converted Mongol elites, who sponsored illustrated manuscripts, miniatures, poetry, and religious architecture. However, after the death of Abu Sa'id Bahadur Khan in 1335, the Ilkhanate plunged into a devastating succession crisis. Abu Sa'id died without direct heirs, and different branches of the Mongol elite began violently contesting the throne. The result was the collapse of central authority and the fragmentation of the Khanate into small states ruled by generals, governors, or noble families. Rival clans emerged, such as the Jalayirids, Chupanids, and Muzaffarids, who, although they professed loyalty to the Genghisid legacy, in practice operated as independent kingdoms, often at war with one another. This Balkanization of Mongol territory coincided with rising external threats. To the west, the Turkomans were consolidating power in Anatolia. To the north, the Golden Horde extended its influence over the Caucasus steppes, and to the east, a new and feared conqueror was emerging: Tamerlane. Though not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, he proclaimed himself the spiritual heir to the Mongol Empire and used the Genghisid tradition to justify his brutal campaigns. By the end of the 14th century, Tamerlane had invaded the former Ilkhanate territories, sacking cities, destroying fortresses, and exterminating entire populations. The ancient glory of Tabriz, Sultaniya, and other Persian cities vanished under the advance of his armies. In time, what remained of the Mongol administrative structure in Persia was completely absorbed or annihilated. Surviving local dynasties adapted to the new scenario, often erasing their ties to the old Khans and adopting identities more aligned with traditional Persian Islam. The memory of the Ilkhanate lived on only in manuscripts, architecture, and chronicles, such as the works of Rashid al-Din, a minister of the Khanate who left one of the richest histories of the Mongol Empire in his work, Jami al-Tawarikh. The fall of the Ilkhanate of Persia clearly illustrates one of the greatest challenges of the Genghisid legacy, the dependence on strong leaders to maintain cohesion in vast and ethnically complex empires. Without charismatic and capable successors, the state machinery quickly collapsed, and in that vacuum no new empire emerged, only a mosaic of fragmentations and endless wars. The absence of a lasting institutional structure, combined with the social pressure of dominated populations and the religious tensions between Mongols and Muslims, exposed the limits of the imperial model born on the steppe. The Ilkhanate, which began as an arm of Genghis Khan's terror, ended up dissolved by the very forces it sought to control: ethnic diversity, cultural complexity, and time. Its fall marks the beginning of the definitive retreat of Mongol presence in the Islamic world, paving the way for the rise of new local powers such as the Timurids, Safavids, and later the Ottomans, that would shape the destiny of the Middle East in the centuries to come. Still, for a brief century, the descendants of Hulagu erected an empire where desert met dome, and where the Mongol sword bowed to the Persian minaret. The Golden Horde, also known as the Kipchak Khanate, was one of the most enduring and influential branches of the Mongol Empire, establishing dominance over what is now European Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and parts of Siberia. Founded by Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, shortly after the stunning campaigns against the Russian principalities and Hungary in the early 13th century, the Horde became a geopolitical and economic powerhouse that, for over 2 centuries, controlled the fate of the Eastern Slavic peoples. With its capital initially in Sarai on the banks of the Volga River, this Khanate was perhaps the longest-lasting among the heirs of the Mongol Empire, but also one of the most transformed, until it disappeared under the weight of internal change, dynastic rivalries, and external pressures. Unlike other Khanates that emerged more quickly and ephemerally, the Golden Horde established a system of indirect tributary rule, allowing local Russian princes to retain a degree of internal autonomy, provided they paid annual tribute to the Khans. This tribute was often collected in the form of gold, grain, slaves, and horses, overseen by Mongol envoys sent to the Russian cities. Though humiliating for the Russians, this relationship created relative stability, as it avoided prolonged occupations and allowed cities like Moscow, Tver, and Novgorod to grow commercially in the shadow of Mongol domination. The administration of the Golden Horde also benefited from its strategic geographical position, bridging Europe, Central Asia, and the Islamic world. Sarai became a crucial trading hub for slaves, furs, honey, wheat, and metals. The city, which housed over 600 mosques at its peak, was a cosmopolitan center where Italian merchants, Caucasian Muslims, Russian Orthodox Christians, Armenians, and steppe nomads mingled. Interestingly, although the Horde initially practiced Tengrism, it adopted Sunni Islam during the reign of Uzbek Khan, 1313 to 1341, marking a profound ideological, religious, and cultural transformation of the Khanate. As a result, the Khans began to sponsor madrasas, promote Persian as an administrative language, and strengthen ties with the Islamic world. But the strength of the Golden Horde would not last forever. From the 14th century onward, the Khanate suffered a series of bloody internal disputes known as the Time of Troubles, a period in which dozens of Khans succeeded one another rapidly, often through assassination, deposition, or defeat by relatives. Central authority crumbled, and regional governors began acting as autonomous rulers. Meanwhile, rival and splinter Khanates emerged, such as the White Horde, the Blue Horde, and later the Crimean, Kazan, and Astrakhan Khanates, all heirs to the original territory, but increasingly fragmented and in conflict with one another. In this context, a new power was quietly rising among the former tributaries, the Grand Duchy of Moscow. From the 14th century onward, Moscow took advantage of the Horde's decline to expand its power, unifying the Russian principalities under its leadership. The symbolic turning point came in 1380, at the Battle of Kulikovo, where the Muscovite army, led by Dmitry Donskoy, defeated a force led by Horde General Mamai. Although the Horde retaliated in subsequent years, the victory at Kulikovo was a psychological milestone. For the first time, Russians realized that Mongol domination could be broken. The final decline of the Golden Horde accelerated in the 15th century. Successive conflicts, the loss of southern trade routes, epidemics, and growing pressure from the Ottoman Empire and the Timurids further weakened the Khanate. In 1480, during the so-called Great Stand on the Ugra River, the Russian army, under Ivan III of Moscow, confronted the Golden Horde's forces led by Ahmad Khan. Without direct combat, the standoff ended with the Mongols' withdrawal, symbolically sealing the end of the Horde's suzerainty over the Russians. Moscow was finally free. Still, the Golden Horde did not vanish immediately. Its factions continued to fight among themselves and govern fragmented regions, but they no longer possessed the prestige, power, or cohesion necessary to uphold the Genghisid legacy. In the following centuries, the splinter Khanates that emerged from its dissolution would be gradually absorbed or conquered by the rising Tsarist Russia, which, ironically, would adopt many of the Mongol administrative, military, and fiscal tools to build its own empire. The legacy of the Golden Horde is therefore ambiguous. It was a force of oppression and destruction, but also of integration and a catalyst for urban and commercial development across parts of Eurasia. It deeply influenced the formation of Russian identity, shaped the structure of Slavic power, and left lasting marks on the political imagination of the region. And as in so many other parts of the former Mongol Empire, the rise and fall of the Golden Horde demonstrates how the horse of conquest can gallop swiftly, but the throne of governance is always unstable, especially when power fails to reinvent itself in the face of time, geography, and the resistance of the conquered. The Chagatai Khanate, formed from the inheritance left by Genghis Khan to his second son, Chagatai, occupied a vast region at the heart of Central Asia, from Transoxiana to the Tarim Basin, crossing arid deserts, frozen mountains, and crucial Silk Road routes. Unlike the Khanates of Persia or China, which quickly became urban and centralized empires, the Chagatai territory retained for a long time an essentially nomadic, tribal, and fragmented identity. For centuries, this Khanate survived between tradition and adaptation until it was completely absorbed by a new force, the Empire of Tamerlane, or Timur, a conqueror who would rise as a brutal echo of the original Mongol spirit, but with even more apocalyptic ambitions. After the formal founding of the Chagatai Khanate in the early 13th century, the territory remained a sort of buffer zone between its sibling Khanates, the Ilkhanate to the southwest, the Golden Horde to the north, and the Yuan dynasty to the east. Its central position made it strategic but also vulnerable. Throughout the 14th century, the authority of Chagatai's descendants eroded due to internal disputes, clashes between Islamized and traditionalist factions, and the challenge of controlling a territory that was extremely diverse, both geographically and ethnically. At the same time, local Turkic and Persianized populations began exerting greater influence on political affairs, further diluting the Mongol heritage. In this fragmented context, a figure emerged who would change the course of Central Asia. Tamerlane, born in 1336, in the region of Kesh near Samarkand. Although not a legitimate Genghisid, Timur claimed spiritual descent from Genghis Khan and used Mongol symbols, titles, and practices to legitimize himself as the true heir to the original empire. His strategy was clear: use the power vacuum in the Chagatai Khanate to establish himself as the de facto ruler, while nominally keeping a symbolic Khan under his authority, a political maneuver that granted him legitimacy in the eyes of nomads, but allowed him freedom to restructure real power. Beginning in the 1370s, Timur launched an astonishing campaign of unification and conquest. He consolidated his control over Transoxiana and made Samarkand his capital. There he began a monumental construction project, transforming the city into one of the most sophisticated cultural centers of medieval Islamic history. But his ambitions extended far beyond art. He would march against the crumbling Ilkhanate, defeat factions of the Golden Horde, invade northern India, conquer Damascus and plunder it, and even defeat the Ottomans at Ankara, capturing Sultan Bayezid I. The cruelty of his campaigns became infamous. Towers of skulls, razed cities, exterminated populations, all in the name of Turkic Mongol order and glory. During Timur's reign, the Chagatai Khanate was effectively absorbed, becoming one of the pillars of his personal empire, although the Chagatai lineage was maintained as a facade until the early 15th century. After Timur's death in 1405, his empire quickly fragmented, like so many others built on personal conquests. But the impact of his rise was profound. He annihilated the last vestiges of unity among the Mongol Khanates and paved the way for the emergence of a new Turco-Persian Islamic culture that would give rise to future empires such as the Safavids, Mughals, and Uzbeks. The Chagatai Khanate, in turn, would survive for a few more decades in its northern and eastern divisions, but without any real unity. Smaller Khanates such as Mogulistan emerged, trying to maintain some continuity, especially in regions of modern-day Kyrgyzstan and Xinjiang. But its influence was reduced to the margins of history. Gradually, local leaders abandoned the Chagatai name, replacing it with local Turkic clans or Islamic leaders. Thus, the last institutional echo of the empire founded by Genghis Khan faded like dust across the steppes where it was born. The fall of the Chagatai Khanate symbolizes the definitive collapse of the original Genghisid model, especially in its nomadic and decentralized form. What survived was the cultural and political legacy, absorbed and transformed by sedentary civilizations. The very notion of Khanates, the rhetoric of sacred lineage, systems of cavalry and rapid mobilization, all of this would be recycled by later empires, such as the Ottomans and the Mughals of India. But the time of the steppe clans had passed. The center of history was shifting once more, from the steppes to the cities, from tents to palaces, from bows to cannons. Thus, with the fall of the Chagatai resistance and the rise of the Timurids, the final institutional chapter of the Mongol Empire as a living and organized entity came to an end. What remained from then on was memory, and like all powerful memories, it would be invoked, feared, romanticized, and manipulated for centuries, whether by emperors, sultans, revolutionaries, or historians. When looking at the ruins of the Mongol Empire, with its fragmented Khanates and scattered armies, it's easy to imagine it vanished like a sudden gust over the steppe. But it would be a deep mistake to ignore the trail of transformations the Mongols left behind, not only with their swords, but also through their administrative codes, political structures, cultural stimuli, and communication networks. During the roughly 2 centuries in which they dominated vast regions of Eurasia, the descendants of Genghis Khan built more than a military empire. They laid the foundations of a global system of interconnection, science, and governance that would echo for centuries even after the collapse of the Khanates. One of the Mongols' greatest contributions to governance was the systematization of imperial communication. The Yam, or Imperial Postal Network, established relay stations every 30 to 40 kilometers, with fresh horses, food, lodging, and official documentation. It was an impressively efficient structure for the time, allowing imperial commands and commercial information to travel thousands of kilometers with speed. This system not only kept the empire's regions connected, but also facilitated the movement of scientists, scholars, merchants, and religious figures, a circulation that proved vital for the flourishing of ideas and technologies throughout Mongol territory. In science, the Mongols created an environment of tolerance and intellectual integration, something rare among medieval empires. Chinese astronomers worked alongside Persian mathematicians, Arab physicians exchanged techniques with Indian surgeons, and European Christian scholars found space in the courts of Mongol leaders. Astronomical observatories were established in Samarkand and Marageh, the latter sponsored by Hulagu Khan, and led by the renowned scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, whose work would even influence the calculations later revisited by Copernicus. Though the Mongols did not produce science directly, they sponsored and protected those who did, creating a kind of Mongol scientific pax. Religious tolerance was also a deliberate and defining trait. The Mongols understood that imposing a single religion in a multicultural empire would be disastrous. Thus, they sponsored mosques, churches, synagogues, and Buddhist monasteries, often simultaneously. Their imperial courts were spaces where Tibetan monks, Nestorian Christian clerics, Sufi imams, and Confucian sages coexisted. In some cases, this coexistence was not merely peaceful, but syncretic. It was common for a single ruler to consult astrologers, from 3 or 4 spiritual traditions before making decisions. This did not mean an absence of religious conflict, but rather a pragmatic strategy for maintaining cohesion in a diverse empire. Written culture also thrived under Genghisid rule. Although Mongol tradition was oral and shamanistic, imperial administrators adopted and adapted local writing systems to record taxes, issue documents, and build imperial archives. In the Ilkhanate, Persian and Arabic scripts were used. In Yuan China, classical Mandarin and Chinese characters were maintained. At the same time, the Mongols attempted to create a unique writing system based on Uyghur scripts, a failed but revealing attempt at forging an imperial identity. The translation of works was encouraged. Greek texts reached China, Indian manuscripts circulated through Iran, and Persian chronicles were read in Mongolia. In the legal realm, the Yasa, the legal code attributed to Genghis Khan, though its full existence is debated, influenced the standardization of laws among conquered peoples. It was a blend of steppe customary laws and practical measures for social control, military discipline, and protection of merchants. Even though it faded over time, the idea of a supranational set of rules applicable to all subjects, regardless of origin, was a precursor to the centralized and meritocratic states that would emerge in later empires. Mongol presence also had a direct impact on architecture, urban planning, and aesthetics. Cities like Samarkand, Marageh, Tabriz, Karakorum, Dadu, and Sarai became urban centers of innovation and cultural fusion. Persian domes, Chinese pagodas, and Islamic minarets were combined in designs that blended nomadic, Eastern, and Mediterranean elements. Even monuments erected by Tamerlane after the Genghisid era carried stylistic and engineering features inherited from the Mongol period. Finally, perhaps the greatest impact was geopolitical. The Mongols created an interconnected world where it was possible to travel from China to the Mediterranean along relatively secure routes, though not without localized dangers. This environment enabled the travels of figures like Marco Polo, who witnessed UN administration firsthand, and Franciscan missionaries who ventured into the heart of Asia to negotiate with the Khans. Europe itself began to better understand the Asian world thanks to these connections, awakening a hunger for exploration that would culminate centuries later in the great navigations and maritime expansion. Thus, even though the Mongol Empire collapsed politically, its legacy remained alive and dispersed, like seeds carried by the wind. Science advanced, cultures dialogued, religions encountered one another, and empires learned. In many ways, the Mongols were the unwitting architects of a larger, more complex and more connected world. And that world, with its roots, languages and legacies, still whispers through cities, maps, and the ideas that shape our present. The 15th century marked the inevitable twilight of Mongol political power. The empire forged with iron and blood by Genghis Khan, which once stretched from the Sea of Japan to the Hungarian plains, had now splintered into fragments, autonomous and disjointed Khanates, each struggling to survive its own civil wars, dynastic disputes, internal rebellions, and mounting external pressures. This collapse was neither sudden nor linear. Each Khanate resisted in its own way across various regions, but the common imperial project had vanished. There was no longer a Yam, no Yasa, no unified command. Only echoes remained, distant voices from a glorious past, now muffled by the rise of new empires. The Russians, the Ottomans, the Timurids, the Safavid Persians, the Manchus. The world moved on, and the descendants of Genghis, once feared as gods of war, became mere pawns on the grand chessboard of history. The Golden Horde, which had ruled over the Russians for more than 2 centuries, was now divided into rival and independent Khanates, such as Kazan, Astrakhan, Sibir, and Crimea. None held the absolute power once centered in Sarai. The Crimean Khanate retained some relevance by allying with the Ottoman Empire, becoming a vassal to the Sultan in exchange for protection and military support. Still, its independence was limited, and its economy, primarily based on the capture and trade of Slavic slaves, signaled a decadent model. The Khanate of Kazan was repeatedly attacked by the Russians until it was incorporated into the Tsarist Empire. The Khanate of Sibir, the last bastion on the Eastern European frontier, was conquered by the Russians in 1582 during a campaign led by Yermak, the Cossack explorer who would pave the way for Russian colonization of Asia. In Central Asia, the remnants of the Chagatai Khanate had been crushed or absorbed by greater powers. In the east, Mongolia itself retained a semblance of Khanate structure, with Genghisid lineages competing for power under the shifting influence of the Chinese, Tibetans, and later the Manchus. But its political relevance was minimal. The old capital, Karakoram, had been sacked and destroyed. The nomadic strength survived only as a cultural tradition and oral memory, no longer as a geopolitical threat. Independent Mongols wandered the steppes, still proud of their heritage, but now subject to the whims of neighboring powers. In Persia and Anatolia, the last remnants of Mongol presence were completely erased with the rise of the Shiite Safavids and the Sunni Ottomans. Both built modern, centralized states with their own ideologies, erasing or absorbing Genghisid vestiges. The Timurids, spiritual descendants of Genghis through Tamerlane, had already collapsed into their own internal conflicts. From that ruin emerged the Mughal Empire in India, founded by Babur in the 16th century. Although he bore the title of Khan and claimed descent from Genghis and Tamerlane, the empire's structure was essentially Islamic and Persianized, a new synthesis in which the Mongol legacy was more symbolic than real. The Mongols' global loss of power was also accompanied by shifts in military technology and political control. The age of swift cavalry and nomadic tactics no longer dominated the battlefield. New empires deployed firearms, heavy artillery, advanced fortifications, and professional standing armies, features the Khanates could not match. The world had become more urbanized, centralized, and bureaucratic, rendering the survival of tribal systems based on blood ties and warrior meritocracy impractical. Yet, despite the political collapse, the memory of the Mongol Empire did not vanish. It continued to be invoked in epic narratives, noble genealogies, administrative documents, and even in later imperialist projects. Russian Tsars saw themselves as heirs to the Khans. The Indian Mughals invoked Genghis as a mythical ancestor, and even the Manchus who founded the Qing dynasty in China regarded the Mongols as a warrior tradition to be respected and emulated. The very history of Central Asia came to be narrated in light of the Genghisid era as a high point of integration and conquest. Thus, the 15th century did not merely mark the end of an empire. It was the end of a nomadic civilizational era, in which the peoples of the steppe shaped the destinies of sedentary civilizations. The winds of the grasslands, which once blew fire across China, Persia, and Russia, were now mere forgotten breezes among distant hills, yet in the sands of time, the hoofprints of Mongol horses still remain, visible to those who look closely. Because empires fall, but ideas, legacies, and dreams of conquest continue to ride. Few historical figures divide opinion as sharply as Genghis Khan. To some, he was the greatest military genius in history, a unifier of scattered peoples, a meritocratic leader who defied traditional hierarchies and opened pathways of trade and knowledge between East and West. To others, he is the ultimate symbol of barbarism, of mass extermination, of the systematic destruction of entire civilizations, the faceless embodiment of total war. The image of Genghis Khan, however, is neither fixed nor universal. Over the centuries, it has been shaped, manipulated, and redefined according to the political, ideological, and cultural needs of different times and regions. The man who began as Temujin and became Genghis Khan transcended his own biography. He became myth. In the medieval Western tradition, shaped by accounts from travelers and Persian and Arab chroniclers, Genghis Khan often appears as the scourge of God, an almost apocalyptic figure. Reports of massacres, like that of Nishapur, where thousands were executed in retaliation for the death of a Mongol general, fueled the image of an inhuman conqueror. To Christian chroniclers, his figure was linked to the Antichrist, or to biblical prophecies about steppe invaders. The death tolls attributed to his campaigns, burned cities, lost libraries, millions of lives, were repeated for centuries, often without distinction between fact and narrative exaggeration. This dark portrayal also served to reinforce the contrast between civilization and barbarism, a useful rhetoric for kingdoms in search of Christian or imperial identity. On the other hand, in Mongolia, Genghis Khan is seen as the father of the nation, a sacred hero, a founding spirit. For centuries, his memory was preserved orally, revered in shamanic rituals, and incorporated into Mongolian national identity. In the modern era, especially after Mongolia's independence in the 20th century, he was rediscovered as the ultimate symbol of national sovereignty. His image began to appear on coins, monuments, stamps, and even the international airport in Ulaanbaatar. For Mongolians, Genghis was not merely a conqueror but a lawgiver, a visionary who united a fragmented people and pursued justice with relentless determination. In China, the view of Genghis Khan is more ambiguous. For centuries, he was seen as a barbarian invader who destroyed the Jin dynasty and imposed foreign rule through the Yuan dynasty. But in the 21st century, the Chinese government has incorporated his image into the national Chinese history, claiming that he contributed to the territorial unification of northern China. Museums, theme parks, and exhibitions now celebrate Genghis as a hero of integration, a political reinvention of his figure to fit within the narrative of a multi-ethnic and millennia-old state. In the Muslim world, especially among Persians and Arabs, the image of Genghis Khan remains largely negative due to the destruction of Baghdad in 1258 by his grandson Hulagu and the extinction of the Abbasid Caliphate. The fall of the theological and intellectual center of medieval Islam was a collective trauma that marked regional memory. Even today, his name is evoked with sorrow, associated with ruin, collapse, and the end of a golden Islamic era. Yet among modern scholars, there is an effort to acknowledge the complexity of the administrative and cultural reforms introduced by the Mongols in Muslim territories. In modern historiography, Genghis Khan has undergone a deep reassessment. Researchers such as Jack Weatherford and David Morgan have highlighted his contributions to global history, noting that despite his military brutality, Genghis promoted religious freedom, protected trade routes, established meritocracy, and fostered intellectual exchange. For these scholars, he must be understood within the context of the 13th century, where the use of force was an imperial norm, and the principles of war differed radically from modern values. In this view, Genghis Khan is neither monster nor saint, but rather an archetype of the pragmatic and ruthless leader, forged in the hardships of the steppe and driven by a vision of transcultural unification. It's also important to observe how contemporary pop culture has revived Genghis Khan in films, series, video games, and literature. He appears as a character in historical novels, features in advertising campaigns, and is even referenced in pop songs and internet memes. His image has been detached from historical accuracy and converted into a symbol of indomitable strength, iron discipline, and supreme leadership. This historical dilution has produced a kind of cultural Khan who adapts to the taste of the times, whether as a symbol of brutality or as a model of visionary leadership. The image of Genghis Khan, therefore, is fluid, multifaceted, shaped by fear, admiration, and battles over memory. He has been villain and hero, barbarian and statesman, destroyer and unifier. His story is also a metaphor for human history itself, made of ruins and rebirths, of light and shadow, of swords and words, and perhaps in that contrast lies his immortality. For as long as there is power, ambition, conquest, and resistance, the name of Genghis Khan will continue to echo, sometimes as a threat, sometimes as inspiration. Behind the leather armor, the recurved bows, and the walls shattered by the Mongol advance, there was an internal world of secrets, surprising social practices, and invisible figures often absent from traditional narratives, especially women, spies, and the silent mechanisms that sustained the largest land empire in history. While most well-known sources focus on generals and khans, on massacres and battles, it is at the margins of these stories that we find the most fascinating threads. The political role of Genghis Khan's wives, the secret codes used in campaigns, undercover agents in trade caravans, and even the specific foods carried by messengers on long imperial missions. Far from being brute force alone, the Mongol Empire functioned as a complex mechanism of control, intelligence, and living culture. Let us begin with Mongol women, often ignored by chroniclers, but of indisputable political and economic importance. Genghis Khan had several wives, but the most influential was Burta, his first and primary partner. Their bond was not just emotional. Burta played an active political role, governed her own territory, and held authority among allied clans. When Khans went to war, women managed the yurts, the herds, and even diplomatic affairs, especially in the central steppes. Moreover, the Mongol system allowed the leaders' wives to maintain autonomous courts. These steppe queens held wealth, commanded their own forces, and were responsible for educating the sons who would later compete for the throne. At times, such as in the 13th century, women like Turagena Khatun and Sorgagtani Beki ruled in practice through regency, exerting decisive influence over imperial politics. In espionage and covert diplomacy, the Mongol Empire was equally sophisticated. Before invading a city, spies were sent disguised as merchants, monks, or wanderers, tasked with mapping access routes, walls, troop numbers, and internal divisions among local political factions. These agents, known as conqueror, were selected for their absolute loyalty to the Khan and trained to resist torture, switch languages, and adapt to foreign environments. One of their most fascinating roles was to infiltrate Silk Road merchants, posing as caravan members to collect intelligence. Records suggest Mongol spies were even present at Christian courts in Central Europe, an explanation for how the Mongols knew intimate details about armies they had never fought. Another fascinating element was their communication and secrecy methods. Critical messages were written on silk scrolls and sealed with hot wax mixed with horsehair, making it nearly impossible to open the seal without visibly damaging it. Yam couriers didn't just carry documents, they also transmitted visual and oral codes, memorized signals that could only be spoken aloud to an authorized agent. In wartime, these messages were committed to memory by young warriors trained to recite them with perfect precision, even after days of riding and with no written backup. Information control was as strict as control over routes and armies. Food logistics also reveal hidden aspects of the empire. Mongol soldiers carried dried fermented milk, erag, dehydrated meat and cakes made from solidified blood, extremely high-calorie and long-lasting foods. On long campaigns, a rider might open a surface vein on his horse, drink the blood directly, and continue riding, a practice that shocked Europeans. Elite messengers had access to fat and honey pills prepared in royal tents, designed to provide energy for days in tiny doses. This attention to survival logistics was a major factor, allowing campaigns to span thousands of kilometers without depending on local supplies. There was also a strong symbolic and spiritual dimension, even after adopting Islam, Buddhism, or Nestorian Christianity. The Mongols retained deep remnants of their original shamanism. Items such as oval stones, vulture feathers, and wolf bones were used in rituals before battles. The eternal blue sky, Mukara Tengri, was still invoked as a protective force and justification for conquest. Many Khans carried leather-wrapped amulets sealed with saliva, believed to be cursed if touched by others. Some generals even brought shamans onto the battlefield, positioning them behind the lines to utter prayers and wind breaths against enemies. Finally, the visual command codes used in battlefields reflected remarkable sophistication. Colored flags, stretched ropes, and spear positions signaled retreats, encirclements, flanking maneuvers, and ambushes. All of this could be reorganized with a few gestures thanks to a strict disciplinary system. The sound of drums, ritualistic chants, and the coordinated movement of horses formed a deadly symphony in which every warrior knew their role. It was like a living organism, where the commander's eyes saw through scouts, his ears heard through networks of messengers, and the body moved as one. These insights reveal an empire far beyond battlefield violence. There was planning, ritual, espionage, information systems, and a social structure that included powerful female voices and invisible agents. The strength of the Mongol Empire came not only from the spear, but from the silence between attacks, from the words unspoken behind the tent curtains, and from the secrets that still astonish us centuries later. More than 800 years have passed since Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes under a single banner and launched a series of conquests that altered the planet's geography, demographics, and even climate. Yet his name endures. In ancient maps, administrative records, fireside legends, and modern search engine algorithms, Genghis Khan continues to occupy space. The question that many scholars, writers, and curious minds ask is simple yet powerful. Why does his name still resonate in a world so far removed from the medieval steppes? The answer lies in a blend of historical impact, political legacy, symbolic reconstruction, and perhaps most importantly, his ability to embody a universal archetype, the absolute conqueror, the extraordinary leader, the man who shapes the world by sheer will. First and foremost, the geopolitical impact of Genghis Khan and his descendants extended far beyond the 13th century. He laid the structural foundations for the rise of numerous modern empires. Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, and India inherited systems of governance, integration laws, and military strategies that trace back to the Genghisid era. The trade routes established by his armies connected the Mediterranean to the Pacific, enabling the circulation of not only goods, but also technologies, religions, diseases, and ideas. The Black Death, for instance, spread along the same routes once secured by Mongol couriers. In many ways, the modern globalized world begins with the Mongol imperial project, albeit through violent and uncontrollable means. Culturally, the image of Genghis Khan persists as a symbol of strength, decisiveness, and total empire. Companies use his name in marketing campaigns. His likeness appears in strategy games, historical series, and epic novels. In some cultures, his face represents discipline and courage. In others, threat and destruction. This dual symbolism, hero and villain at once, makes him a perfect dramaturgical figure for contemporary storytelling. He is the warrior who never hesitates, the man who turns defeat into leadership, the orphan who overcomes all obstacles to conquer kings and emperors. Science has also contributed to his symbolic longevity. Genetic studies conducted in the early 21st century suggest that approximately 16 million men alive today may carry a genetic marker linked to Genghis Khan's lineage due to the widespread proliferation of his descendants. This not only fueled popular imagination, but also positioned Genghis Khan as a common ancestor on a planetary scale, unprecedented for any other historically documented individual. The finding made headlines, became a scientific curiosity, and further reinforced the myth that seems endless. Modern Mongolia has transformed the Khan's image into a national and cultural symbol. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the country reclaimed Genghis Khan as a pillar of identity and sovereignty. His name adorns airports, universities, stamps, currency, and honorary titles. Giant statues of horse and sword dominate Ulaanbaatar's skyline as constant reminders that the man who once led the largest land empire ever recorded was born there. And more than that, Genghis Khan has become a diplomatic and tourist icon, featured in narratives that portray him as a strategist, legislator, and symbol of nomadic wisdom, far beyond the image of the destructive warrior. In academic circles, Genghis Khan's figure has undergone deep reappraisal. From the barbaric villain portrayed in Persian and European chronicles, he has come to be seen as the architect of a rational administrative system, a promoter of religious freedom, and a defender of justice adapted to the context of the steppes. Books such as Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford helped solidify this new image, emphasizing state efficiency, interfaith tolerance, meritocracy, and the elimination of hereditary privileges, values that strongly resonate with the contemporary ethos. Furthermore, Genghis Khan represents for many the triumph of perseverance over a hostile fate. Born in a harsh environment, betrayed by allies, abandoned by his tribe, hunted by rival clans, he survived it all. He rebuilt his authority from nothing, forged alliances, restructured traditional systems, and created a command structure that remained functional even after his death. This extreme story of overcoming adversity makes him an almost mythological symbol of resilience, evoking archetypes familiar to all cultures: the fallen hero who rises, the outcast who becomes king, the leader who unifies. Finally, there is an emotional and timeless factor: humanity's fascination with the absolute. Genghis Khan was not just a ruler. He was the pinnacle of a kind of power no longer seen in the modern world, a direct, almost mythical power where one man's word could change the fate of millions. In an age of bureaucracy, mediation, and relativism, Genghis Khan's image emerges as a brutal contrast, and perhaps for that very reason is so magnetic. He reminds us that no matter how much the world changes, there is something in us that continues to seek figures who represent totality, of strength, will, empire, and memory. Few historical mysteries arouse as much curiosity as the question, where is Genghis Khan buried? The man who reshaped the political landscape of Eurasia, who commanded armies as extensions of his will, and founded the largest land empire ever recorded, vanished from history without leaving behind a known tomb, mausoleum, or any official funerary monument. His death, which occurred in 1227, is recorded in various sources, yet the location of his burial remains unknown to this day. What is left are legends, archaeological hypotheses, and a millennia-old silence that turns his grave into one of humanity's greatest unresolved enigmas. According to Mongol tradition and chronicles such as The Secret History of the Mongols, Genghis Khan died during a campaign against the Tangut people in western China from causes still debated. Some say he was wounded in battle, others suggest he fell from his horse, and there are even more dramatic versions, like the legend claiming he was castrated by an enemy princess before killing her. Whatever the truth, his body was supposedly brought back to Mongolia by a small group of loyal guards, determined to fulfill a wish the Khan himself had made clear, to be buried in absolute secrecy, in a place where no one could ever disturb his rest. The most widespread version holds that the funeral procession crossed the steppe and buried the body in a hidden valley in the Khanates region, near where Genghis Khan was born. To ensure secrecy, the soldiers transporting the body allegedly killed anyone they encountered, herders, travelers, hunters. After the burial, those same soldiers were executed by a special unit, which was in turn killed by another group, sealing the chain of secrecy. The area was said to have been trampled by 1,000 horses to erase any trace of the grave, and a forest was planted over the site. It sounds like a dark epic, but it resonates deeply with nomadic culture, which viewed death as a passage and the body as sacred, to be returned to the earth quietly and without ostentation. In recent decades, archaeologists and modern treasure hunters have turned their attention to the Khanates region, particularly to Burkhan Khaldun Mountain, revered by Mongols as sacred. Numerous expeditions have been launched, some supported by the Mongolian government, others led by foreigners using advanced technologies like ground-penetrating radar, drones, and satellites. In 2004, a project sponsored by National Geographic used satellite imagery to identify artificial patterns in the terrain, but no definitive trace of a tomb was found. Researchers faced the challenge of respecting Mongolian cultural sensitivities, as many locals consider the search for Genghis Khan's grave a spiritual offense that disturbs the great leader's rest. Among alternative theories, some believe he was buried far from Mongolia, perhaps in Tangut territory, symbolizing his final conquest. Others point to underground regions beneath the old Avraga complex or areas near the Onon River. But none of these hypotheses are backed by material evidence. What exists are fragile clues, incomplete maps, conflicting oral traditions, and an almost mystical pact between past and present, that Genghis Khan must remain unseen, for his tomb is sacred, and the true empire he left behind is the silence that echoes through the mountains. The fascination with this enigma goes beyond archaeological curiosity. It is also a reflection of humanity's relationship with its greatest myths. The idea of an invincible conqueror whose body was never found evokes the same kind of reverence associated with Alexander, Jesus, or King Arthur. While other empires built tombs, colossi, and pyramids to secure eternity, Genghis Khan vanished into the anonymity of the soil, and in doing so, achieved an even more powerful form of immortality, that of absolute mystery. Thus, the tomb of Genghis Khan remains, if it exists at all, hidden somewhere where the wind whispers through the trees and wild horses still gallop. And perhaps that is the ideal fate for a man who lived among nomads, ruled with an iron hand, and was buried by time itself, because some leaders build empires with stone, others build with silence, and it is in that silence that Genghis Khan remains alive, impenetrable, eternal. In a world saturated with new technologies, digital networks, and constant transformation, it may seem unlikely that the echoes of an empire founded 800 years ago still resonate so strongly. Yet the Mongol Empire endures, not as a territory, not as a government, but as a deep mark on the collective memory of humanity. It has become a symbol of strength, continental integration, brutality, and brilliance in equal measure, and its persistence is no accident. We speak of the Mongols because in some way they still speak of us, about our ambitions, our fears, our systems of power, and our most complex legacies. The first reason for this immortality is the unprecedented scope of its expansion. The Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous empire in history, and that word, contiguous, is key. It unified lands that had previously had no direct connection, from China to Eastern Europe, from Siberia to the borders of the Middle East. More than that, the Mongols built administrative, commercial, and diplomatic networks that reshaped the world's roots. During the height of the so-called Pax Mongolica, it was possible to travel thousands of kilometers with relative safety, something unheard of in the Middle Ages. This connectivity, though forged through war, laid the groundwork for future global flows of ideas, goods, and religions. Furthermore, the history of the Mongols touches on universal themes: leadership, discipline, adaptation, meritocracy, and the moral dilemmas of absolute power. Genghis Khan and his generals organized an efficient and flexible war machine, based not on aristocratic lineages but on competence and loyalty. Many modern leaders study Genghis's strategies not out of ideological admiration, but because they recognize the pragmatic value of his organizational vision. He knew that diversity could be a strength if well managed, that speed, surprise, and terrain knowledge were more valuable than sheer numbers, that fear could be a weapon, but that justice and order were also essential to sustaining an empire. We also talk about the Mongols because their contradictions mirror our own. They were both destroyers of cities and patrons of the arts. They burned libraries but promoted translations. They massacred entire populations but established codes of law and religious tolerance. These ambivalences force humanity to confront an uncomfortable truth. Civilization does not advance in a straight line. Sometimes it emerges from chaos, violence, and the brutal reorganization of ancient structures. The Mongol legacy, in this sense, is that of an empire that deconstructed before it reconstructed, and this dynamic of rupture and reinvention is part of history's very cycle. Modern popular culture also keeps the Mongols alive. They appear in series, films, novels, games, comics, and even music. This constant presence, even when caricatured or inaccurate, reinforces their permanence in the collective imagination. For many, Genghis Khan is an archetype, the fearless leader, the outsider who conquers the world, the unbeatable strategist. But for others, he is a warning that power without limits can turn men into myths, and myths into monsters. The duality of his image keeps debate, reflection, and curiosity alive. Science and genetics have also shed new light on their history. With advances in DNA studies, Mongol ancestry has been detected in unexpected places, revealing the depth of the genetic imprint left by generations of conquest, marriage, and mixing. Archaeology continues to search for signs of tombs, palaces, and artifacts that expand our understanding of that period. And modern historiography, increasingly interconnected among cultures, revisits sources from Mongolia, China, Persia, and Europe to reconstruct a fairer and more plural narrative of what this empire truly was. Finally, we speak of the Mongols because there is something in them that reminds us of the power of human will. Genghis Khan started with nothing, abandoned, hunted, without a stable clan, and within a few decades became the ruler of millions. His success wasn't luck, but the result of strategic vision, adaptability, sense of timing, and an almost hypnotic leadership. In a world that values entrepreneurship, resilience, and swift decision-making, Genghis Khan reappears as a disturbing symbol, not of a moral ideal but of power in its rawest form. Thus, even though the horses of the empire have vanished from the Eurasian plains, even though its cities have crumbled and its roots have been forgotten, the spirit of the Mongol Empire remains alive. It pulses in maps, in stories, in memories, and in the very dilemmas of modern humanity. Because some empires die, but others, like that of the Mongols, transform into invisible permanence, always lurking, always reborn where least expected, in imagination, in ambition, and in the eternal quest to understand power.